a good majority of my clients are in their 20s. And those are the ones that are saying, no, I am no longer, I don't know the English translations for this, so I'm just going to use it in Arabic, and you feel free to translate. I'm no longer going to allow for what my parents have taught me as aib to be haram. It's either haram or it's not. Just like a quick little thought process, right? When we talk about generational trauma, right? And I said it goes back 2 generations, right? The stress that mom is feeling while she is carrying the baby gets directly transferred into the baby. They learn a similar stress response, right? And I'm not 100% sure of why this is the case, but research tells us that if a dad is depressed in the first 2 trimesters of mom's pregnancy, that has a negative impact on the baby. Right. And so that's one big thing that I see is that it's kind of perceived like I'm doing enough by providing, and it's not. I am seeing an improvement, honestly, with the newer generations, but the newer generations are suffering the aftermath of dad not being available from their time.
Do I want to be a parent who never gets feedback from my kids? Like, would I want to be a parent who, because they're so respectful or scared of me, they can never give me feedback, and then I never listen and hear what they're saying and try to improve my role as a parent? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how should people be weighing those things?
Yeah, well, and that requires that you do a little work around that idea of I'm perfectly imperfect, right? And it's okay to make mistakes. It's safe to make mistakes. It's kind of interesting how it corresponds perfectly with Islam, the psychological perspective. Is, you know how in Islam we're taught your mother, then your father, right? Psychology says mom is about 70 to 75% of our well-being. Dad is about 20 to 25%, right? Because mom is the person that you look towards for survival needs.
Is there anything that fathers can do to, just to stay on this topic a little bit, fathers can do to take that burden off the mom? Or is it, because I can tell you, like, I got a 3-year-old right now. We have a couple older kids, and then we have a 3-year-old right now. And if it was like we're on a raft and there are sharks circling the raft, and he has to choose between throwing dad or throwing mom into the water to feed the sharks, he's throwing me for sure. He's saving mom, like 100%. Recording. Welcome.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
Ahla wa sahla.
Thank you.
It's really great to have you. Before we get started today, I just want to do a real quick reminder to anyone listening, to the audience, that this is a new podcast. According to what I know, I've asked around and we're pretty plugged into some of the social media stuff in the community. I do believe it's the first actual podcast studio that's Muslim and Palestinian and Arab owned and run, and with the purpose also of trying to really provide a forum, a table for discussions around so many issues that are important to us as Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, as really in general, as just people in the United States in our current times, to try to really tease out some of the hottest topics, things impacting our communities, our families, our relations with other people within America. And so my motivation, which we might get into a little bit with this podcast, is I think there are some interesting topics we're going to hit on, has really been to try to provide that forum and try to get as many people talking to move us in a more positive direction as much as possible. So I'm really happy and excited to have this up and running, and also to have you here today. And I just want to remind people to please subscribe, like, and share. I know everyone watches YouTube videos and stuff and thinks, oh, why does the host keep on saying that? Like, I used to do the same thing, but now that you're actually running a podcast, you're like, oh, there really is a value to that. So please, if you want to support what I just described and you're in favor of this becoming something bigger, please support it by subscribing, liking the videos, and sharing as broadly as you can on your social media accounts, regardless of who's on them. This is really for everyone. So, and with that, I will start off by introducing Amnah Dahla, who's with me today. She is a resident of this community. She's down in Orland and has a really interesting perspective based on her work. And I really was super excited that we had the opportunity to get you here. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for you being willing to do this and being able to spend the time with us today. So maybe you want to give a little introduction about who you are and kind of what you do?
Well, for sure. Thank you for having me, first of all. It's an honor to be here. So I am a mental health therapist. I usually like to clarify because whenever I say I'm a therapist, people are like, what kind? And so mental health. Currently, I own a private practice in Orland Park. We're about 18 therapists right now. 14 of us are Arab and Muslims. And we primarily service the Muslim and Arab community. I've been there for about coming on 7 years now.
Okay.
Right? And so I think one of my motivators to get into this field to begin with was, honestly, I was more motivated towards how do I do something in my lifetime that's going to make a difference, right? Mm-hmm. That when I'm, kind of standing in front of our Creator, weighing my deeds of, good and bad and what I did with my time, therapy just kind of, it kind of spoke to me. So I'm like, this is what I want to do. So, went back to school, got the degree, started some work in the hospitals, realized like this isn't really serving our community, which is really interesting because you would hardly see anybody of Middle Eastern descent or hardly any Muslims in the hospital setting, which got me thinking, are we not utilizing mental health services as much as maybe we should, right? And so then I kind of slowly worked my way out because again, my purpose was to work within our community. So here we are, 7 years later, and I really didn't intend it to grow, but
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. But I think what happened is that, the need is just so great in our community, and alhamdulillah, something that I don't know that people are aware of. The stigma is far less than we previously believed it to be, right? People are seeking services. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty much at capacity right now with my 18 therapists.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And how many, I have a few follow-up questions to your introduction, but
sure.
How many clients or patients can a therapist see? So 18 times what is what people should be somewhat doing the math on roughly?
So
to give a sense of scale.
For a therapist to do their job without burning out quickly, 25 a week is considered full-time.
Oh, wow.
I have some therapists that are seeing 30 to 40. I have some that are doing 15 to 20, right? So on average, we're doing 600-700 sessions. No, actually, we're doing more now. I haven't been keeping track since we've added therapists. Full disclosure, on top of owning the practice, I also carry my own full-time caseload because I'm super passionate about the work, not so much about the business part.
There's so many business owners or like entrepreneurs out there who can like relate to that, I think.
Yeah, maybe we should have a podcast on that at some point because, definitely, I'm definitely carrying a really heavy load myself too. So let me do some quick mental math if you don't mind. So
sure.
20 times 20. We're doing about 400 sessions a week, I would say, on average at the practice.
That's
right?
very impressive.
So, yeah.
It's self-validating too, right? Because you said that your underlying assumption from the beginning was like, where there's a need. And then when you see that, all of a sudden you can relatively quickly, I don't know the business of therapy to know scale and speed, but it sounds like fairly quickly be able to get to that volume of people, and the demand must be high. And so that validates your overall sense, that intuition that there was a need for this. So that's awesome to hear.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because I think that the need was maybe overlooked because there wasn't a lot of Muslim or Arab providers for a while, right? And now it seems to be, I know more people than I can count who are in school to become therapists, right? And so,
Oh, wow.
alhamdulillah, because at some point we are going to run out of, providers who can offer these services to the community,
Right.
right? Because you can only take so many people on. So, alhamdulillah for that. But we're growing not only in the number of people willing to seek help, but also the number of people wanting to provide it.
And you mentioned that you went back to school. May I ask kind of just briefly what that journey was so you weren't a therapist at one point. It wasn't like your early college goal and out of high school. Some people do that, or was it?
The funniest thing about that, I remember being very, very young, and when people would ask me what I wanted to do for a living, like, I want to be a marriage counselor. I don't even know how I knew what that was, if I'm going to be honest with you, but I clearly remember that that's what I said.
At a young age.
Yeah, but
interesting.
I made some decisions, right? I got married really young. I was 18, had my first kid at 20, then my second at 21, and then my last kid at 23. And then I had some health issues that kind of got in the way. And I think the health issues are what got me thinking about therapy, because my first run in trying therapy was when I was struggling with my health. And I don't know, it didn't feel right. Something about it was like, I don't know that I would have said what you said. Not knowing, now I know, yeah, you definitely shouldn't have said what you said, right? And so I think that actually got me thinking, maybe I should. And so I literally started from scratch at that point, just started some community college classes and worked my way through.
Oh, wow. That's impressive.
Yeah.
Especially juggling motherhood and being, part of a family that has its demands on you and everything. I witnessed my mom. She went back to school when she was I was older. I mean, I remember it clearly. She was probably, 50-ish. And I mean, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Just anytime going back to adult education or adult reality and then going back to school is a challenge. So you must have really been motivated and felt like there was a real calling.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I feel like, when people ask me, oh, tell me about yourself, first thing I say, I'm a mom and I'm a therapist, right? Those two things are really, really important in my life, right? So.
Okay, interesting. Definitely, I don't know, for some reason I was expecting like I've born and raised a therapist kind of story. I don't know why. A lot of people I've known that have gone into this, like, it's just like they knew from out the gate, and then having some kind of a self-realization or epiphany or whatever you want to call it, and then going that path to me is really cool, because we'll get into it a little bit, but I have gone through something similar recently where I think a lot of people listening could benefit too, because they probably are feeling the same thing, where they either reached a point in their late 20s, early 30s, or maybe it's late 30s, early 40s. And there's just that inflection point when you see the number 3 as you're turning 30, or you see 4 as 4. It just gets in people's heads, I think. And people kind of have a little bit of a freak out moment going, oh my God, I am actually that age now. And so maybe we reprioritize or rethink some of our choices when we were younger and go, man, I wish I would have done more of this, or, not gone down that path and done this instead. And I think I think the brave ones are the ones who then take themselves up on that chance, that opportunity, and they'd say, I'm going to do something. I think it takes a lot of courage, and we can get into some of that too. But what are your thoughts around, just briefly, we'll get into more detail, but like inflection points in life and how people react to them?
Well, I think it's really unfair that at the ripe age of 17 or 18, however old someone is when they graduate high school, it's like you're literally going from an environment where you have to raise your hand and get permission to go to the bathroom, right? To figure out your entire life now. Decide what you want to do for the rest of your life, right? Research does show that people have an average of 3 career changes in their lifetime. So I think that, I think that if we don't let ourselves evolve, as we grow, it's not gonna feel good for us, right? And our emotions do play a huge role in how we function in this world, right? So if we feel like we don't belong in our job anymore, and it might fit for a while, and then it might not fit, right? I think that everybody should leave themselves open to opportunities. And I recognize, especially within the Arab community and the Muslim community, because there's a lot of pressure on the man to, you have to provide. And so you have a little bit less flexibility sometimes with being able to say, I don't like my job. I wanna do something completely different. I want to go back to school. But, you know, with the right support, I encourage everybody to always continue evolving.
This came up in another podcast episode recently, and it feels good to be able to say we have other podcast episodes, especially when we're just starting out, by the way. So some people might be chuckling as they hear this. But I liken it to like molting. Like it's like you gotta, there's like insects, I think reptiles, other creatures out there that they molt, right? They get to a certain point where their skin doesn't fit them. Yes. And I feel like anytime in my life where I've had that feeling, it was like something was calling to me or screaming at me, like you need to change something.
Yeah.
And whether it's a role at work, it could be the same company, but it's like I need to promote, I need to seek something else. This is just, I've outgrown my shell and it's limiting me and it's not making me happy and that kind of thing. So that's my way, my analogy, I guess I use. So we talked about basic, your specialization, your practice, that kind of thing. You mentioned who your typical clients are, which I think is really interesting because I was hoping we could get into some stuff that's specific to one community over another in terms of some of the issues that you see or some of the things that we need to be aware of. We talked about what made you want to get into this type of work. You and I found a mutual, when we were talking, trying to set this episode up, we found a mutual kind of mentor or someone we admire in Gabor Mate. And I was really wanting to touch base with you on kind of what your thoughts of Gabor Mate are and why you find him to be so intriguing and kind of that mentor role like I did. I found him through 2 books. I went and looked him up because I was trying to remember the titles. The first one, I believe, was The Realm of Hungry Ghosts. That's where a lot of people, I'm talking like this is like early democracy nowadays, maybe like 15, 12, 13 years ago. I heard of Gabor Mate and I was like, who is this guy? So interesting, so on point with a lot of what's being, discussed and what's going on socially. And the other one was Hold On to Your Kids. Those 2 books resonated the most with me, but you want to share like what your Gabor Mate kind of
That's interesting.
admiration comes from?
So my 2 favorite books are When the Body Says No and The Myth of Normal, right? So I often will recommend one or the other or both, depending on what a client comes in, talking about their struggles and if it kind of fits for them. If it's a health struggle, When the Body Says No. If it's more like I want to understand why I'm feeling this way, it doesn't feel normal, I will recommend the other book. But I have to tell you a funny story about Gabor Mate. So there's this organization called SANS. Are you familiar with it? Mm-mm. So they basically, it's not necessarily podcasts that they do, but they have like live tapings with Gabor Mate. And if you're one of the first 100 people that get on to the site when his recordings are being done, you can interact with him. And so one day I'm like, all right, I'm going to get up early. I'm going to get on here. I need to talk to him, right? And I get on, I'm like, oh my God, I'm like number 90, fantastic, right? And then I accidentally logged out.
Must have been just hitting yourself in the head.
I was so angry. I was so angry. I actually stumbled upon him by accident. I'm sure you're aware that he does a lot of, he talks a lot about Palestine, right? And how he was a Zionist at one point, and then he spent some time in Palestine and spent the entire time there in tears, is what he says, right? Because he saw the state of the people, and now does a lot of trauma work with people in Palestine, right? He'll go, I think he said every year, and spend a couple of weeks with like the women that were incarcerated, and he does a lot of work with them. So my initial draw to him was that, to be honest. I just wanted to learn more about him. But then, as I had mentioned earlier, some health conditions is what drove me, in part, to start looking at this field. Like, how can I do different than the therapist that I saw? How can I use that to say I did something useful in my lifetime, right? And so Gabor Mate's work has a lot to do with how our emotional state really does impact our physical state and how different diseases are formed from different types of trauma. And so I think that's really why I love his work. I was actually listening to his book on the way here.
No, he's amazing. He's like the gift that doesn't stop giving.
Right.
Like, I mean, anything you hear a lecture by him, I would encourage anyone out there who hasn't heard of this man. His name is Gabor Mate. We'll put a link in the description, but Gabor Mate. And really one of the most intriguing public figures, I would say he's kind of become, in my opinion, of like our times. I mean, for him to be specialized in so many topics and write so many books about things that are so prescient to our society and our time, modern era, technology, addiction, behavioral patterns, family things, and to have such a strong social stance on different, like Palestine, a lot of social issues. It's really impressive, and he comes at it and he maintains a very scientific and very like analytical mind about it. That's what I think is really impressive.
There's also in one of these recordings with this organization that I was telling you about, it was just open to questions. He literally left it open to questions. And so he got a lot of people getting on there, a lot of people who were really angry with him for his stance. And the way he handled it was so amazing, right? It just got me thinking, how do we get better at doing that? Right? How do we learn how to not continue to respond to so much of the negativity in a way that's going to hurt us, right? And there was a couple of moments where he cracked, and then he was like, I'm sorry, everybody, for what you just witnessed. And it was like not even that big of a reaction, but for him, right? And, he said something like really, it probably didn't seem big to the, average viewer, but when I was watching, I'm like, wow, this could not only help us, as Palestinians dealing with this, I don't even have words for what we're dealing with because it's so difficult, right? But it's also in our day-to-day lives. He said something along the lines of, when you're dealing with someone and you're having a difference in opinions, right? Whether it's, somebody who is pro-Palestine and somebody who's, either both sides or pro-Israel, right? But this also applies to our day-to-day, is he said, are they open to another perspective, right? Are they willing to consider someone else's point of view? And if they're not, you're only going to cause yourself frustration. So just stop, right? And I say that all the time to people when they come into therapy, talking about just their day-to-day, their interactions with their spouse, their interactions with anybody in their life, right? Are they willing to look at another perspective around this topic? Are they open to it? If not, then you need to just disengage, and we need to figure out, is this a perpetual problem, something that's just not gonna,
That's a very meta thing to say, right? Like meta in the sense of, a lot of times I feel like all of us, when we're dealing with our spouses, kids, parents, conflict in general in a family or even societally, right? You have to ask a question first, which is like, what's your goal here? Or if even I've helped people with like friends and family with like business or financial decisions, and they come to me, and it's for some reason people like to ask me my opinion. I'm not a therapist or a counselor officially, but it'll be like, what do you want from my answer? Do you just want to be heard? Are you looking to vent? Or are you actually wanting my answer that you may take action on? Those are two different things, right? And it's amazing how even like at a societal level, for us to talk to each other about like the issue is complicated and controversial for whatever reason as Palestine, you have to do that. Just like you're talking to a person, right? Like, do you want to actually listen? Are you listening?
Yeah.
Do you want to hear what I have to say, or is it just, do you want to, vent?
Can you listen without feeling triggered, right? Because, and I don't know how much you want me to talk on this topic, but at the end of the day, when we're triggered, it means that we're coming from an old, painful place, right? And that disconnects us from having access to this, right? We no longer have access to our logic when we're triggered. And I think it's safe to assume that most Palestinians get triggered around the topic, right? And so I think it would be hard to have a conversation with somebody in general, like I said, in general, when somebody gets triggered by what we're talking about.
I do want to stay on this for a little bit. Yeah. I want to go down this rabbit hole with you a little bit. So one thing that I've noticed, and part of what I'm trying to do is, because I think just being born and raised in the Midwest and speaking, perfectly clear Midwestern news anchor English and understanding the culture so well, I feel like there's so much misunderstanding because people have not actually met a Muslim, one in America. For big parts of the country have never met someone in their life who's Muslim, especially not Palestinian, because they're a smaller minority of the Muslim community in America. And when you get to these issues, they're always sensationalized with like news clips of like nowadays, the big thing I've been talking about is protesters, all of a sudden someone disrupting a venue. We had the famous Microsoft situation recently. Yeah. Someone gets up, they start shouting, they start, and I think that for whatever reason, I think it may be a bit of a right-wing kind of conservative movement that's happened in this country, or phenomenon where being triggered, the snowflake accusation, the hypersensitive accusation is always thrown out. And protesters, where in my mom's generation, her era, when we were growing up, she'd say, oh, you wouldn't believe how beautiful it was in the 60s, the 70s, the Vietnam War protests, the anti-war movement. It was this thing of like a badge of honor. And now for some reason, protesting and people being a little bit disruptive to bring attention to a social issue, it's almost like there's a counterculture push to make it something that's shamed or something that isn't quite looked at as a positive. It's not a brave thing. It's like, oh, you're just, oh, please shut up. You're disrupting this venue. We just want to get on with our lecture. Why are you bringing this up? Why are you bothering us? Can you talk a little bit about like that sense of being triggered and why for some people, this is their last resort as a way of kind of expressing that internal thing that you were describing? Like,
ooh, okay, so we want to talk about triggers. This is my favorite topic, if I'm going to be honest, okay? But it's going to take some time. So
sure.
Are you okay with
We've
that?
We've got time.
Okay. So I think that there's a misconception around what triggers are, right? People are like, oh, I'm triggered, don't talk to me, right? And they think, oh, what you just said made me really mad. That's actually not a trigger. Okay, I think something that people aren't aware of is that we do not feel our feelings in our brain. We feel them in our body, right? So what does that mean? So just think about, last time you had to slam on your brakes to avoid an accident and it was really close. What was the first thing you felt?
A rush. I would describe it as like a rush of anxiety, like a rush of a wave, right? Where it's just like you don't even have to think about it.
Yeah, your heart probably started racing, maybe your stomach dropped, right? Yeah. So what we know is we have emotional brain 1, right, which is our chest, because that holds a lot of connection memories, right? Emotional brain 2 is our stomach, that holds a lot of danger memories. And then emotional brain 3, right? Well, people think, no, you made me mad, that's it. No. So those memories of connection wounds, if we feel something in our chest, it's safe to assume that something about attachment, probably when you're younger, right? Because there's a saying we have in this field. The older the memory, the greater the impact, right? So something that happens when you're 18, 19, 20 is going to have less of an impact on you than something that happened when you were a newborn baby, really, right?
That's very counterintuitive to me. That's why I'm like, interesting. I've never thought of it that way.
Oh, yeah, okay. Definitely. So you're going to feel something in your body. That means that an old memory got triggered, right? Or what I like to call an ouch spot, right? Something that hurt, that you're reminded of. And now you're going to feel like you're in that memory. Now you're going to react like you're in that memory. And when it shuts off your access to logic, it's hard to come back and say, okay, I know what this is. I know that this is, 5-year-old me remembering when I was getting in trouble for whatever I was doing at the time, right? We don't think that. And so that actually shows up a lot in relationships, right? When we fight with our spouses and, it's like, okay, well, now I don't feel good. Now something feels bad in me. And then you're reacting in a way like you're still in that 5-year-old situation, and there's no convincing someone in that moment that no, actually what happened is you got triggered, and this is what triggered means. This person isn't hurting you, you're already hurt, right? And so, believe it or not, a lot of the work I do now is actually marital counseling. So I don't know how that ended up happening, if I'm going to be honest, but it is super rewarding. So I don't know if that answers a lot of like what a trigger is thus far? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
And so
I think if I'm understanding correctly, just to, that we can align, that way we keep the audience moving with us too and learning. So the trigger is really something from the past, a deep memory or wound of a memory, maybe, and the situation that in the present brings that up instantly. Like if you're in the car and all of a sudden you slam your brakes and you feel like you might hit someone and you panic. Similar? Is that a good summary?
Yes.
Okay.
So at some point in your life, you felt like you were in danger. Your stomach picks that up because, again, that's kind of like the danger part of the brain, right? And you felt it in there because you felt like you were in danger.
Okay. I'm following. Interesting. So part of what I'm thinking with this current situation that we were describing with protesters and with, the Palestine issue and stuff, I feel like for me, I don't know if it's a trigger, if technically you could call it that, but I think there are a lot of people who are feeling potentially like it is a trigger, and that is silence, not having a voice. No matter how much you yell, no matter how much you want to try to correct something, no one's listening. And I think that I have examples from my past, my childhood, where unrelated to like politics or some kind of humanitarian situation, I felt like I was voiceless. No one was listening. I was shouting as loud as I could at the top of my lungs, and no one could hear what I was saying in terms of pain I was going through, emotional pain, psychological pain. So I could see the analogy working when it comes to like a collective group of people that have had no voice, have been marginalized, silenced. Could that be a trigger in the same sense?
Well, so now here's an extra layer to all of this, right? There are some triggers that are not our triggers, okay? For those of us who've never lived in Palestine or any other, war zone or oppressive situations, if you will, we can still feel what I'd like to call small or inferior, right? Or unheard or invisible, or however, someone describes that. Kind of all the same feeling, but just described in different ways, right? So if you don't mind, I can even maybe use you as an example, right?
Sure.
And in full disclosure, part of one of my biggest struggles right now is that I struggle to make sense of what's happening in the world, right? I struggle to cope with it. And so there's a thing in therapy that you can't take a client any further than you've taken yourself, right? And since I haven't figured out how to deal with it, I'm struggling to help people deal with it, right? But I will say that when we think about growing up Palestinian, I'm going to stick to that for right now, right? If, and by this point, by this generation, like even my kids' generation, right? We've had grandparents that lived through 1948, right? And then our parents maybe even we're still living in Palestine maybe during the Intifada or whatever, right, the case may be for them. So what we know about generational trauma is that at very least, and this is what we know for now because this is what the research has told us, we're carrying the trauma of 2 generations back, right? So we're carrying the trauma of our grandparents, our parents, and then that gets weaved into our, our nervous systems, and we respond to things as if we experience them, right? And so I think that there's a lot of different factors at play when we talk about why we feel silenced, why we feel like we can't make an impact, how frustrating that feels for us. So some of it is our own trauma and could also just really be growing up in a home where what you needed didn't matter. Right? Or if that's actually your perception of it was that what you needed didn't matter. Right? Or if you were hurt, that didn't matter. No one cared. It's all about perception, not necessarily about what happened, because I know you probably heard this from Gabor, but he says trauma isn't what happened to you. It's the meaning that you made out of what happened to you and how you learn to respond to stressful situations as a result. Right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
So there are a couple of different rabbit holes to go down here that I'm interested in. One of them is, I feel like collectively, people, other Palestinians, I think in general, Muslims in the United States, in the West more broadly, experience this sense of and this is the challenge, right? It's, you know, the old adage, they say, think globally, act locally. Mm-hmm. There's a sense that I feel like our parents kind of inculcated in us of like, think globally, but then like wish you had a magic wand to fix globally. And that's just not, like, I feel I struggle with that because I have family that, you know, are very into like the news cycle, the news junkies, right? Constantly just obsessing about what's going on out there. And lots of people are like that nowadays, especially with social media and 24-hour news cycle and all the rest. But what is your advice in terms of like, how do you perceive like a healthy way of gauging the global, but then being able to then siphon it down into something actionable that you as one person in Bridgeview, Illinois, or Orland Park, Illinois, your little me self can actually do something and not be crippled by the weight of the global? Because we're not leaders of states. We're not, you know, people, your average person that just doesn't have the reach, the impact to be able to like stop something terrible from happening, right?
Yeah, I think that there's a few different avenues here, right? And I'm not comparing what's happening in the world to my little therapy world, okay? Sure. But I will say that a lot of new therapists, and, you know, myself included when I first started, our biggest struggle is we want to help everybody. We need to fix everybody's problems, right? And when you learn that you can't do that, right? It's number one, not your job to fix anyone, right? It's your job to provide knowledge and support. It's your job to help people see clearly what's happening in their lives, right? And you can kind of come to terms with what you can do, right? Versus what you wish you could do, which is magic wand everybody that walks through your door to be okay. And I actually say that to clients all the time. I'm like, look, I wish I had a magic pill I could give you and you can walk out of here and not feel sad anymore and not be anxious and your life would be great, but that's just not how it works, right? Mm-hmm. And so realistically, 5 to 7 years sitting on my couch and, you know, we're hoping we'll see some progress. And so I think that like being able to recognize what we actually can do is helpful so that when we have these bigger goals and it doesn't work, we can kind of come back to, well, this is what I could do, and that's okay. So, sorry, have to go down the trauma rabbit hole again, is why do we feel the need to do more than we can, or why don't we feel okay when we can't do more? That sounds like what I like to call an old story, right?
Interesting, yeah. It's almost, I mean, would you say that it's probably trauma related to a past experience, if I'm interpreting correctly, kind of the lesson so far on this topic? For some reason, you were made to feel like you needed to fix everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So like now it's like you're an adult. It's not just fix whatever went wrong between you and a parent or you and a sibling or whatever. It's fix the world.
Yeah, I like to call it the I'm responsible for everything wound. And interestingly, that's a wound that usually forms between 4 and 6 years old.
That early?
Oh, my goodness, yes. Are you familiar with Erickson?
I don't think so.
Okay, so he's, you know, he's pretty back there, right? When we talk about like Freud and then Adler, and then, you know, he's a little more recent than them, but he's been out for a while, right? Okay. And he has what we call a stage theory of development, right? And it really informs a lot of the work of any what we call psychodynamic therapists, which I consider myself one, which basically means you can't understand your present until you understand your past. And a lot of what's hurting us today is unresolved childhood needs, right? And so Erickson says that even before you're born, emotional wounds start, right?
I'm just taking notes.
Yeah, sure. And like 0 to 18 months is when the I don't matter wound develops, right? Simply by whether or not a baby's needs were tended to in a predictable and consistent manner, right? And a lot of these parents, and I'm sorry for anybody listening who's done this, but a lot of parents who have the cry it out, you know, method. I mean, what you're really telling a baby who doesn't know anything about the world is that his needs don't matter. And so you'll see a lot of these people later in life trying to stay in their head as much as possible, right? Really don't consider emotional parts of what's happening in their interactions with people, right? And so it's that young that we develop this unbelievably painful wound that we carry for the rest of our lives, right? And what we do to cover those wounds, or the ways that we protect ourselves from feeling those wounds, I think is really, we need a whole podcast just to talk about that, if I'm going to be honest with you, right?
Sure.
And so like then the next stage of life would be, 18 months to about 4 years, and that's competency, right? Like, is it okay to make mistakes? Do I do good enough? And then the one after that is, am I responsible for everything, right? Usually people start to think they're responsible for other people's suffering, that the only way that they can maintain attachment to primary caregivers is by taking responsibility for things, right? The sad reality is a 4 to 6 year old isn't built for those kinds of responsibilities. So now you created an incompetency wound too, right? Because if I'm supposed to take care of these things, but I'm always getting yelled at because I can't successfully take care of them, right? Now they're learning another negative thing about themselves, and we carry that with us, right? Until we figure out that that's what we're doing and we resolve it.
And how much of it, in your opinion, can be, like, I don't know, is there a term for people like that who have that sense that they always want to be fixing everything around them? Is there a term for it, I guess? I'm just curious.
I would say that it's just anxiety, to be honest, right? Sorry to keep going down this path, but it's just such an important topic. I think that something that people don't know is that attachment to primary caregivers, when we are really young, and how we learn that we have to maintain that attachment is probably one of the biggest impacts on our entire lives. So if we learn that to make sure that our mom still loves us, right? That we have to take responsibility for, younger siblings, or if mom says, oh, now something common that I hear a lot, that a lot of, especially my Middle Eastern clients, if I'm going to be honest, will say is that mom will be like, look what you did, your behaviors now, your dad is mad at me, right? And so now we feel responsible for our mother's suffering, right? So what do we learn? Oh my God, I have to manage all of this. I can't be responsible for her suffering. I have to take responsibility for all of this, right? So I'm sorry. Tell me your question again, because now I got on my soapbox and I forgot.
Fine. I was curious. It's like the eternal fixers, like the who never can stop because it just irks them that something around them is dysfunctional, a person, the way someone's living their life. They're constantly trying to just like fix other people's issues.
Yes. And so that definitely comes from early childhood attachment, right? And it's kind of interesting how it corresponds perfectly with Islam, the psychological perspective. Is how in Islam we're taught your mother, then your father, right? Psychology says mom is about 70 to 75% of our well-being. Dad is about 20 to 25%, right? Because mom is the person that you look towards for survival needs, right?
Especially if it's happening at that young of an age.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And so what, in a young child's brain, whatever we need to do for mom to love us, because that means she will take care of us, now gets associated to survival. And it gets hardwired in you, and you're going to keep doing it across your lifetime. So if we learned we had to fix when we were little, now there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of anxiety around the idea of fixing all the time because your brain is still connecting it to survival.
There's like a reward mechanism that you were ingrained with, that if you fix, you get something positive probably from your mom, from that relationship, or it's reinforced through that action, and then you just carry it on the rest of your life.
Safety. Right? You get safety, you get care, you get to stay alive, because little kids can't keep themselves alive. They need somebody to do that for them, right?
Is there anything that fathers can do to, just to stay on this topic a little bit, fathers can do to take that burden off the mom? Or is it, because I can tell you, like, I got a 3-year-old right now. We have a couple older kids, and then we have a 3-year-old right now. And if it was like we're on a raft and there are sharks circling the raft, and he has to choose between throwing dad or throwing mom into the water to feed the sharks, he's throwing me for sure. He's saving mom, like 100%. So is there anything that dads could even do to kind of like take the pressure off mom to not, because I feel like moms are also human. Like they're going to make mistakes. Like no matter how much you try to be perfect as a parent, you're going to make mistakes. You have your own flaws, whatever. Is there anything dads can do to take the pressure off? Or what's the best thing a dad could do to support mom to not have her be like negatively impacting them in any way or minimize it, I guess?
See, every question you ask has
Tons of
yeah, like, do I start with what dad and mom both need to be doing while the baby's in gestation? Because that's actually where it starts, right?
Oh, take it. Yeah. So take us from the very, I mean, I didn't even think that was a concern. So
Really?
let's start.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, not to that extreme, I would say,
yeah.
but let's start from there and maybe give us like a high level kind of up through when they're now, okay, they're on autopilot a little bit. They're adult, they're kind of like, older teenagers, or they're out in the world doing their own thing.
Sure. Okay. So just like a quick little thought process, right? When we talk about generational trauma, right? And I said it goes back 2 generations, right? The stress that mom is feeling while she is carrying the baby gets directly transferred into the baby. They learn a similar stress response, right? And I'm not 100% sure of why this is the case, but research tells us that if a dad is depressed in the first 2 trimesters of mom's pregnancy, that has a negative impact on the baby, right? But the interesting thing is, the one thing that I tell people all the time is the biggest thing that a child needs is a happy mom, okay? So then, I have couples coming in, like, see, you just need to work at keeping me happy. And I'm like, well, it is actually impossible for someone to shut down all of their feelings so that when they're being triggered, right, or they're not having their needs met, that they're fully capable of meeting the mother's needs. And so I think that it's really important for, married couples to understand that them having a good marriage is going to psychologically impact the child, or a bad marriage, right, will impact the child for the rest of their lives, right? So how do we make for a happy mom? We have to have 2 happy parents, right? So it's not, and a lot of women watching this are going to be really mad at what I'm about to say. It's not about happy wife, happy life, happy spouse, happy house is more like it, right? So we have to work on marriage. And if there's one kind of therapy or counseling in this case that I really push, is premarital, right? Let's work on some of our own stuff before we have a kid, because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? But and what you were asking is, how can you, and you know what, if your 3-year-old throws you over, good, that's developmentally appropriate. They should cling to the person. Yeah, they should cling to the person that they know is more responsible for their survival, right? So we're doing good.
That's good.
Yeah.
I mean, he'll feed me to the sharks, but at least I know that, it's better for his overall future.
Exactly.
Right? Which I would throw myself into the sharks to save him anyway.
Oh,
so.
God, of course. Yeah. Of course. So I guess there's a couple of things, right? Is making sure that we keep as happy of a home as we possibly can, right? With the idea of, like you said earlier, both mom and dad are going to make mistakes, right? And so I tell people this all the time, like, take the anxiety off the table of what if I traumatize my child? You're going to. Just be prepared, right? It's not about will they have trauma. It's about what will their trauma be, right? And so
not all trauma is the same.
No.
We can come back to that. I don't want to derail you, but that's an interesting point, because not all trauma is the same, and what level and intensity of trauma, I'm sure, matters, right?
Yeah, and how early you experience the trauma, right? Because remember from what I said earlier, the older the memory, the greater the impact, right?
Right.
And abandonment wounds are amongst the most difficult wounds to work with in the therapeutic setting, right? And I know people would probably think like abuse of some sort, right? But we can actually work through certain types of abuse a lot easier than we can abandonment wounds, even if the person wasn't actually abandoned, right? If it was more of a feeling of neglect. But we can definitely talk about that again a little bit later if you'd like. As far as what dad can do to support, so the research tells us that dads, they have 2 primary, things that a child needs so that the trauma from dad is minimized, right? Which is be present and don't be abusive, right? If you'd like to talk about what I'm seeing in the community around that, I'm happy to, but be present and don't be abusive, right?
Yeah, sure. And if you have examples, and we can come back to it, because I do want to talk specifically about our community. I think there's some benefit in doing that versus just in broad terms. But yeah, if you want to touch on it lightly, go ahead.
Yeah. And so that's what a child needs from dad, right? And even not just physical, but of course physical abuse off the table, right? But even emotional abuse, because dads have more of an impact on a child's ability to feel capable and competent, right? Dads are the ones more likely to allow the child to take risks, right? Like, you want to go down this massive slide, I trust you, you can do it. Where mom's like, no, you're going to get hurt, right? And so if the child takes that risk and then the dad's like, what's wrong with you? Why would you do something so stupid, right? Things like that are going to impact the child's ability to grow up feeling like, hey, I can try things. It's okay to make mistakes. I know what I'm doing. I'm good enough, right? So I think that's the greater impact that dad has on a child is in that realm, right? And in the arena of how do I make sure that they know that my connection with their mom is a happy, healthy one, and that I'm not negatively impacting this person that they're looking at like, you're responsible for keeping me alive. This person is damaging this person that keeps me alive. So now I'm going to have negative feelings towards, my dad as a result.
This is a big one. I think this one, it really resonates with me because I feel like, how do I want to describe it? It's the difference of perspective, right? Like when you're a kid, your parents are the world to you. They don't do wrong. When you're at a certain age, up to a certain age, right? Like your parents are just saints, let's say. Mom's Mother Teresa and dad is, I don't know what a good analogy is, but anyway, so they're just incapable of really doing anything that would make you hate them or really, unless it's something really terrible. But even then, I'm sure I've heard stories where physical abuse, the kid still loves dad and just says, oh, he goes to a dark place sometimes and he hits me or does this or that to me, but overall still love dad. So kids are very much like that. And I think the perspective of adulthood in relationships is so different, right? Like we look at a spouse as in a different term, right? It's not your mother, it's not your father. It's like, this is a spouse, someone I chose. You have things in common or you don't. You either fell in love or you didn't, depending on how people came together. Maybe it was an arranged marriage situation, which is more common, I'd say, in our community a lot of times. But anyway, point being, you can look at your spouse and go, I know that person's weaknesses. I know their strengths. I know what the value proposition in marrying them or being with them was. A lot of people think in these terms. But for a kid, that's not the way they look at their parent. So can you speak a bit about how we need to be careful in terms of how we frame each other in front of our kids? Which I feel like when couples fight, that's probably the most challenging piece is like, you have an audience if you have kids. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, so that's why I think that premarital is so important, right? Because we need to learn how to be able to manage those triggers, right? And my husband may or may not disagree when I say this, but I feel like, after spending a decade plus now being a therapist, right, and learning my triggers, I am able to manage them a lot quicker because usually to get a trigger under control and get back what I like to call online with the brain, right? Minimum of 20 minutes for the nervous system to reset, right? And so could take up to 24 hours though. So I think I'm really good at being able to say, something in me got triggered. I don't have access to this. So please just give me a minute. Because then that says to, my husband that I'm not capable of processing this in a way that's not going to cause damage. And so I think that one thing that couples could really learn is how to do that so that they're not fighting in front of the kids, because there shouldn't be any fighting in front of the kids. When kids are really young, dad is always going to be the bad guy. I have yet to, sorry.
It's so true. No, it's true. It's true. They look at you like you're, if you raise your voice just a little bit, that little kid will look at you like you are a monster. What are you, you know what I mean? And they just don't have the context. They don't know. You're like, I'm at like out of 1 to 10, that was a 3. And the kid's just, freaked out thinking you're a threat to the whole entire safety of, you're like, I just raised my voice a little,
Yeah. And then,
the way they perceive things.
And then upset their mother. And now you're like the monster of monsters, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that it's really important that couples learn how to manage conflict in front of a child. Like, you really should not have conflict. And when sometimes it arises, if we can learn techniques to calm ourselves when we're triggered, be able to kind of remind ourselves, me not addressing this right now doesn't mean that I don't matter, because it could touch one of those wounds if we start telling ourselves our needs don't matter. And coming back to it when we can get back online. And so learning those skills, I think, is really important.
And you mentioned a couple examples, probably just a train of thought thing. In our community, what are some examples that you've seen? What are the common kind of things that you see that maybe we don't realize are very much shared?
Oh, man. Oh, there's so many different things, I think. One of the interesting things that I have clients that are not Arab, not Muslim too. And there is a difference, right? So one of the questions we ask when people first come in, is there any abuse in the home? And, non-Arab are far more likely to say, yes, I was hit a few times or whatever the case may be. And Arab are just like, no, just, the standard, maybe the belt here and there, or, not abuse. I'm just like, no, that's abuse.
Sure.
And so the sad realities, I think that this is, again, what gets passed down from generations. And we, may think that this is what you're supposed to do because, look, I came out good. And so this is how I came out good. And it's a big misconception, right? So I would say that that's probably part of it. And no shade at dads, okay? I get it. Again, women are probably not going to like what I'm about to say, but, in a culture and religion and community in which the man has all of the pressure of figuring out how to pay bills, right? And I wouldn't want to be the man in the relationship, if I'm going to be honest, right? I like the women's perks that we get. It's not easy, right? Like, it's not easy to do that, and I get it, but I think that sometimes in our community, and not all, okay, this isn't saying everybody, I'm just saying that what I'm seeing a lot of is that dads tend to say, well, I'm working, I have to work to provide for the kids. This is my role. And that's it. I did what I had to do. And then they're never around, right? Because, a lot of people in our community are business owners. A lot of people in our community work high-stress jobs, right? Medical professionals who are pulling 12-hour shifts, multiple days per week and not really seeing the kids. And what did I say earlier is the greatest impact that a dad makes, being present and not abusive, right? So, well, there you scratched half of that off by not being present.
Right.
And so that's one big thing that I see is that it's kind of perceived like I'm doing enough by providing, and it's not. I am seeing an improvement, honestly, with the newer generations, but the newer generations are suffering the aftermath of dad not being available from their time, right?
And so this is an interesting topic, so I want to stay on it for a little bit. I guess before we get into it even more, how would you describe the difference in this community between working class versus, I don't know if you want to call it like educated class or professional class? I feel like there's a difference. Like, I have friends in other parts of the country, large Arab communities, where they're like, it's all like, PhDs and, like if you like Seattle, Microsoft, you've got, people who are all very highly educated, highly white collar kind of jobs. Yeah. Here, it's very much, I feel like, since moving here 7 years ago into the city, it's working class. And I love it because I think we have a lot more of a dynamic and a different mix of people that adds to the overall vibe and flavor of the community. But what are some differences that you see between maybe working class families that are Arab or Muslim and professional class? Is there a difference that's noticeable?
I'm trying to think through most of my, my caseload over the years, just to give a more broad perspective on this. I really don't see many people who have, typical 9-to-5 type of jobs, right, that aren't so dedicated to those jobs that they're not spending enormous amount of hours at work rather than with family. So then that kind of goes back to, what is it about our community that says you can't rest, you have to be the best. Being good enough isn't enough. Right? So I don't.
So whether it's a working class job or a high, it's the time that you're saying, the time away from the kids or not being spent in quality time with your kids is the thing that really matters, not necessarily which widget you're working on, as you know, in terms of the family.
Presence, right? It's not like, okay, I'm home with my kids, but I'm sitting on my phone, I'm responding to emails, I'm taking work calls, but I'm calling myself home, right?
Yeah, you're checked out mentally. You're not sitting in the same room as people.
Yeah, so it's
We're all
really
guilty of that.
Totally, right? Which is, something that should be looked at, obviously, but it really is about presence too.
And you reminded me of like Chris Rock kind of bit, like a comedian, like a black comedians talking about how getting like a butt whooping was completely normal in their upbringing. Like mama would get the belt, or I got in our community it's always hafaya, it's always flip flops for some reason that are being used as projectile weapons to like abuse or get children into like into submission. I guess talk a little bit about that, like the whole idea of like smacking your kids using a belt. And there's different grades. I mean, I'm sure there's people out there who've done like a little pat where like the kid just thinks it's something, and that could be traumatic to them and be perceived, like you were saying earlier, as the same as the real deal of actually inflicting pain. But I think there are maybe fewer people who actually do it to really inflict pain. But what's the impact of even a non-painful, slap or hit or belt, or what's the modern wisdom on that?
I'm going to go therapist on you, and so you can kind of feel into this one. So if a parent who is they're the people that are supposed to care about you the most in the entire world, right? And a child can only perceive it as intentional harm, like you intentionally harm me. What might that do to a child's belief and their ability to trust?
So it really isn't, even if it's a pat, the fact that you're acting like it's the real thing, they perceive it as the same.
Yeah, because it's literally breaking trust, right? That I can count on you to genuinely care about me. Causing pain and caring, do those feel like they go together? Right?
Yeah. And is there, for those who say, well, throwing a flip-flop is way different, is there any difference in terms of a belt versus a flip-flop?
No.
Whether it's being feigned or not?
No. I'm not going to say that there aren't different types of physical, that aren't going to be heavier.
Yeah.
Right? Depending on, another soapbox, okay? You've heard of fight or flight response, right? So it's not that simple, actually. So what we know is it's flock, freeze, flight, fight, faint.
Flock, freeze. You're going to have to walk us through that.
Yeah. So depending on how high level we feel the threat is, it's like a response system kind of thing, right?
Okay.
And so if the perceived threat is like low level, like, I'm not super scared, and I'll use this example because I think a lot of are afraid of dogs, right? And I don't know what that is for us, but we are, right? If you're walking down the street, there's a lot of people, and there's like a dog who's loose, kind of coming near, your first line of defense is going to be, look, there's a lot of people here. I can flock. I can just stay within the group of people and I'll be okay, right? That manifests in the day-to-day as people-pleasing usually. As long as I keep people happy with me, I'm going to be okay, right? First line of defense. It means I'm nervous but not, super scared. Boost that up a little, right? The next level is freezing, right? Like, I'm just not going to move. If I see that dog coming at me, I'm just going to hold still. Hopefully he won't notice me. If there's no people to keep me safe, I'm just going to freeze up. He won't notice me. Maybe he'll keep going. That dog is, darting towards you. What are you going to do? You're going to run, right? If he gets you in a corner, you're going to fight, right?
Yeah.
But if you're in a corner and you're going to lose that fight and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to die, right? Then the amazing thing that happens in the brain and the body is that the brain dumps all of these chemicals, to numb you from being able to feel the physical pain. It separates your kind of conscious awareness from your physical presence. And that's what we know as dissociation, right? or, some people will say fainting if it gets to the level of like you're actually passing out, right? And so now if we learn to respond to stress or to fear by dissociating, then you're going to see that happening across a lifetime whenever a feeling like that moment comes up.
So, and some of us have known people like this. I know a few people I'm thinking of in my past, like where they shut down. It's just complete collapse or shutdown when introduced to that stimulus or that thing that like you're talking about. And so how does that seems like on the hierarchy you were mentioning, it's like a gradient. So that's like the most extreme example. What has to happen to elicit that?
Usually
that dissociation. How extreme does the action have to be?
It's really more about the perception that my life was in danger and I couldn't do any of those other things to keep myself safe. I couldn't run. Again, it's more of an analogy of like backed into a corner, and fighting isn't going to do anything. And so if you think about like a young child who, somebody is laying hands on, a young child is helpless, right?
They can't leave.
No.
They're not going to get herd immunity or protection.
Yeah.
They can't fight. They stand no chance.
Yeah.
So dissociation becomes way more possible.
I mean, in
many more situations.
You have to. It's really more like I've already committed to the idea that I'm going to die, right? And so all I can do right now is just numb what's happening. And then that's when we hear a lot of people when they say I'm emotionally numb, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
That all makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm putting the dots together in my head. So what would your advice be for whether it's the Arab community or I'm sure I have like Hispanic friends and Black friends that like, they're like, oh, that's standard in our community too. Like, oh yeah, you're going to get the belt or you're going to get the shoe thrown at you while you're going out the door or whatever. What is the current modern day research balancing also like knowing where this culture that we all lived through growing up is pretty thick. Yeah. What is the advice on how to deal with the proper way? A kid's not behaving and it's something they truly shouldn't be doing. It's legitimately something that they need to correct their behavior on. What's the approach that you'd recommend?
So if we're talking about maybe people who are actually walking through the door, seeking help, saying, hey, my kid isn't acting right, I don't know what to do with them anymore. I personally shy away from working with children. It's not my wheelhouse, right? Sure. But to understand adults, you have to understand children, right? So that you can work with adults and their childhood wounds. But I think that, parents need to take accountability for the fact that their child isn't doing well because of their environment. That's why therapy with kids is so hard, right? Because if you can't change their environment, nothing is going to change. Whatever they're doing is somehow, protective. It's somehow survival-based for them. And so I think that's something that, parents really need to understand is whatever is happening in the home is what's impacting the child, right? So there needs to be a level of acceptance first before change can be created. And I would say it's hard sometimes. Like we get a lot of pushback, like, no, it's not that. They're difficult. And so getting parents to buy in to no, they're not. Their environment is causing this. So I think that the hard part is getting parents to buy into it, right? I haven't yet quite found a way that, that makes that easy other than to work through the parents' own stuff of helping them understand why does it feel so bad for you to accept that maybe you were imperfect, that you've made some choices that have caused your child pain. And, we can correct some of that. I think one of the things that people don't get, and I don't want to say just our community, I think in general, but again, I work primarily with our community, so, it's where I'm seeing it the most. We don't feel safe in making mistakes, right? We just don't. We don't feel safe in the idea that we're human beings and we can make mistakes and then clean up the mess that we've made, and then that's okay.
Do you think it's so we're kind of in the weeds and not in the weeds in a bad way, but like in the thick of, I should say, our community. So let's dive in. I have a bunch of questions around this that I was hoping we'd hit on. So, do you think it's from like an overblown or outsized image that comes from like a kind of patriarchal dominated culture? I mean, I feel like there's definitely that like the father is the, the man in the house, the main provider, the boss of everything kind of mentality. Does it come from that where like, I mean, I guess for one question is the oversized, I can't make mistakes or I never do wrong mostly dominant with men, or is it women, or is it both?
Both.
It's both.
Definitely both. And it depends, again, on the upbringing, right? Like, we can only be the kind of parents that we know to be because of how we were parented, right?
So does it come, I'm sure everyone out there that's listening to this is going to be thinking, if they're Muslim, they're going to be thinking, so how do we balance it? Does it come from possibly the whole concept in religious, I would say Muslims for sure, but also other faith groups, segments of society that are Christian, conservative, practicing Christian, practicing Jews, whoever it might be, that like your parents are sacred. There's that concept in scripture even, right? Like your mom and dad, you said earlier, mom, 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 then your father, from the famous saying of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So how much of it is that, do you think? The bir al-walidain concept.
You really just hit on something really huge, therapeutically speaking. Probably the biggest barrier in therapy with new clients is that they won't even talk about their childhoods because they feel tremendous guilt saying, yeah, that hurt me. And, then it makes it hard to understand, then what are you responding to? How do we work on rewiring some of this for you, right? And so I'm not even going to sugarcoat this. It has taken me sometimes years to get people to a place where it's like, you're here so that you can have a healthy relationship with your parents. You're here so we can, you can understand yourself. And you can't understand other people if you don't understand you, right? So if you learn yourself and you learn, I respond to things like this because of these experiences that I had, then you can actually transfer that knowledge to your parents. Like, I can understand that they were doing these kinds of things because of the experiences they had, and it wasn't about me, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that that's really something that it's really tricky in our community, because you're right. People come in feeling guilty, even in therapy, so much as saying, yeah, they hurt me.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a sense that, the whole concept of, for those who aren't Muslim that might be listening, bir al-walidain is this concept in Islam of, really it's after you being dutiful towards your creator and fulfilling your creator's your obligations towards your creator, then the next entity is your parents. That's the idea, the concept. And so in Islam, you definitely have the sanctification of parents above all others, et cetera, as a very key theme and key principle or value. So the struggle is like, how do you balance, right? Like in American Western culture, like growing up watching TV, like the kid will be like, Mom, stop being X, or, Dad, stop doing Y, or, and it's kind of like this sassy kid who's like speaking back to their parents. And we as Muslims were like sitting there kind of going like, how are they even saying this? Like, how is this kid saying that to their parents? Like, they can't say that. They shouldn't. It's disrespectful. But at the same time, I look at like being born and raised in the United States with more Western culture and American culture. I try to take the good and leave the bad and kind of fuse a hybrid style way of living. Do I want to be a parent who never gets feedback from my kids? Like, would I want to be a parent who, because they're so respectful or scared of me, they can never give me feedback, and then I never listen and hear what they're saying and try to improve my role as a parent? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how should people be weighing those things?
Yeah, well, and that requires that you do a little work around that idea of I'm perfectly imperfect, right? And it's okay to make mistakes. It's safe to make mistakes, right? So I think that that's part one, is figuring out how to rewire some of that for yourself, that it's okay to make mistakes. And I'm going to, right? I'm going to make mistakes. Children do not come with a manual, unfortunately.
Right.
We wish they did.
Yeah.
There are some good books if anybody wants some recommendations. One, he doesn't hold a candle to Gabor Mate, but Peter Levine wrote a book of how to trauma-proof your kids. It's a really decent resource and funny story, since my son, inshallah, in under a month now will have his first kid, my first grandbaby. That's how he told me that he was having a baby. He bought me the book and he gave it to me, and he's like, well, me and you were going to read this and we're going to book club it so that you can trauma-proof my child, Mom. And I said, oh boy, okay. And so I read the book. It gives some pretty decent information, right, that's helpful to, I would say, new parents, people considering being parents. It's a decent read, right? So I think like educating ourselves about kids' needs. But I think culturally speaking, and culture plays a huge role in the idea of a kid's needs often get overlooked by a parent's preference. And those preferences are wired a lot through our own experiences, but also culture.
I want to jump into culture in a second. I have one more thing that I'm dying to ask you about this. So as a parent, it sounds like, there are so many ways to manifest as a parent. None of them are perfect. None of them, there's some that are definitely extremes are, better than others. Obviously, someone who's very abusive to their kids it's one extreme versus someone who never lays a hand on their kids. Those are two obvious demarcations. But I'm trying to take away like actionable things for myself and also for the audience in terms of what can we do to do better, to be better, right? And I think self-awareness, from what I'm hearing you talk about, is key. Being clearly aware of how you're perceived, not just what you think you're putting out. And then also that really it can be putting yourself in their shoes to see how they perceive it so that when you adjust what you're doing, they don't feel it's traumatic, right? Like you don't want to associate what you're doing with trauma. Are there any other pieces of advice you'd give parents out there who are listening to say, like, these couple principles will help get you there 70% of the way? Just keep them as philosophy kind of things in your head as you work through parenting and figuring it out through life with your kids. That'll make things most likely better.
Yeah. So one thing I would say, and I know it's hard, believe me, I haven't been a parent to a young child in a long time, so I can talk about this as if it's easy, right? But at the end of the day, it's like really acknowledge that if a child is behaving in a way that doesn't feel good or doesn't, meet some kind of a standard, that really means there's some hurt there. There's an unmet need. So how can we take a step back? What do we need to do within ourselves to be able to take a step back and ask, what does my child need right now, and how do I give him that or her, right?
Okay. That's a good one. It's simple too, right?
Yeah.
It's not like super complicated to think about. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the unmet need, and why is this behavior manifesting? It's not for no reason.
No.
It's not just because they want to be a stinker.
Totally.
That kind of mentality,
right? Like when a child throws a tantrum, there's something behind the tantrum.
Yeah.
Right? There
and
is.
Even if they're older, not like tantrum, like sitting at like the Walmart aisle, they want candy and they're banging their feet on the floor. That age, we're talking even like early teen, like I think 10, 11, 12-year-olds are tricky because they're all not quite teenagers where you can just go, oh, teenagers. People do that a lot. It's like, no, they're able to, what I'm seeing with my kids is like they're able to express themselves in a way that a really little kid, a toddler, can't. But then they're not quite teenagers where they're old enough to really, in a sophisticated way, be able to express themselves. But I think that just understanding that from their perspective, it takes humility, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to. And that for us to be humble, to listen with both ears and really just slow down and not judge. That's I think the most challenging thing, but also you can see where it's the true medicine or the true benefit.
And you know what? Teenagers are a challenge. There's no doubt that parenting a teenager is challenging, right? The sad reality is they're going through it too. We never really think about that. We're like, why do they just want to make everything so difficult? But those teenage years are really like identity formation years. And it's really scary. Like, I don't know who I am, right? And if we're raised in really restrictive environments, you don't even have the capacity to learn who you are, right? Because you're told who you're supposed to be, and you just have to kind of go with it, whether it feels right for you or not. I mean, one of the things I hear all the time is, my parents are making me go to med school. My parents are, right? And so that really does impact a lot of things for an adolescent. It increases the frustration they already naturally feel. So this isn't me making excuses for bad behaviors of, adolescence, but also we have to ask ourselves, is this developmentally appropriate, right? If an 11-year-old is throwing a tantrum, then we know that's not developmentally appropriate, because how old are we when we throw tantrums? 2, 3, right? So now if we're seeing an 11-year-old act like a 2-year-old, my first question as a therapist is, what happened to you when you were 2 years old? Because then now we're talking about what we call arrested development, or a part of you got stuck in that trauma and was never able to move forward. So when that gets triggered, now you're acting like that 2-year-old. Now you're showing 2-year-old behaviors.
Interesting. And just to play devil's advocate, I'm sure some people are thinking the same thing. So I want to ask, how much of it could be, or is there, how do you balance the trauma versus there's a feedback mechanism that they realize if I do this, I get this. I can manipulate, or I can, how do you view that in light of like trauma too? Like
1,000,000%. I mean, now we're talking about conditioning, right? And I think the biggest struggle with parents is when I talk to them about this is like consistency is key. So you have to be okay sometimes if you want to change behavior for, the good of your child. You have to be consistent in saying, I'm sorry you feel badly, but no. I'm sorry that you're, feeling something. And if I can help you, if I can really help you, I'm here for you. But this is not allowed. And if this happens, these are the natural consequences of what's going to come, right? Not I'm going to beat you, not I'm going to, natural consequences, right? Like if, a little kid, you want to jump on the couch, you don't want to listen when I say don't jump on the couch, you have choices. You can listen, and then I won't feel upset with you, and you won't get hurt. And so later, if you want to go to the park, I'm going to feel good about taking you to the park. But if you keep jumping on the couch when I'm telling you it makes me upset, I'm going to feel upset with you. So if you want to go to the park later, I'm probably not going to want to take you. Natural consequences, right? And I think we want to teach our kids that at a very young age.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think the natural impulse, not just in our community, but parents in general, is to like, how do I want to say it? Well, I should say like what we don't want to do is be making them feel bad, like to hurt them. You don't want to be trying to, okay, well, here's your punishment. And I'm going to make you feel like crap, or physical. Obviously some people turn to that, but I'm saying, even if it's not physical and it's like, I want to make you feel bad to kind of poke you, and then you're going to not like that, and therefore you're going to listen, versus never having that be on the table and it being about cause and effect.
Yes.
And then they learn that this behavior brings this outcome. It's almost Newtonian and not as emotional and hurtful, really. It almost minimizes the trauma. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And even when we talk about, like, for adolescents, I will say one of the big things is if you cut off their resources, right? You don't give them money anymore.
Sure.
Which is really one of the only powers that parents have over adolescents to some extent, right?
Don't let them know that. No one. Don't let the secret out. Yes. Yeah.
Right. But it's like, it's not that I don't want you to be happy. Of course I do. But again, the natural consequence of when you're behaving in ways that really upsets or hurts or triggers or whatever it does to me, I don't really feel like I just want to do nice things for you. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think that it's like helping them understand that there is a natural cause and effect, that parents are human too. We have feelings too. We have needs too. I think that that's really helpful in that relationship. But I have to tell you that the single most powerful thing that I have seen between parents and children, a little bit older children, obviously, is an apology.
You don't see it?
No, I do. It's the biggest factor in change in a parent-child relationship is an apology.
From?
The parent.
The parent.
Yeah.
Why do you think there's resistance to that? To me, like I'm like a modern dad or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to brag. I'm not a perfect father by any means, but I'm just saying, I'm a work in progress continually and always will be. But like, I don't find it problematic to say I'm sorry to my kids for some reason. It could just be a great thing that I've naturally got from whatever culture, conditioning, life experience. But I think to sit your kid down and say, hey, listen, I really screwed up. I raised my voice at you. I snapped at you. I was under a lot of stress in that moment. It doesn't excuse it. It didn't warrant what you didn't warrant that. Like, why do you think that is so problematic for some people?
Because it goes back to the idea that it isn't safe to make mistakes, right? And it also, I think, in our culture, goes back to this idea that the parent is right no matter what, right? And that just is not conducive to a child's mental health.
Is that culture or is that religion?
I'm going to go culture all day long on this one, right? Because religiously, we are supposed to show kindness to our children, right? We are obligated to raise them correctly, right? But isn't kindness like a central aspect of our religion to even strangers, let alone our children? So I'm going culture all day long on this one. I mean, I'm happy to have a conversation about
No,
it.
I was asking because my intuition is similar in that, like, how much of it is just this thick culture that we've inherited from generations, right?
Yeah.
And part of one of the central tenets of Islam, if you don't mind us getting into it a little bit,
Yeah.
one of the central tenets of Islam, right, is this idea that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that the best of you is the one who's best to his family.
Yes.
And he said, I am the best to my family, meaning I'm the
Yes.
best of you as God ordained
Yes.
because I'm the best to my family. Or I'm best to my family. Maybe it's, whichever one feeds the other, chicken or the egg. But point being, it's so, I mean, I just can't imagine if we had a prophetic model for parenthood, which we don't have as much of that as we do in terms of being a spouse, because of the condition and situation of the Prophet's children. A lot of them died at a young age, et cetera, if not all of them. Most of them, sorry. I guess my question is, when you look at culture, okay, a lot of times it's hard for immigrant communities to, especially Muslim immigrant communities, to separate religion from culture. And if we look at religion, we think in our heart of hearts, no, you should be humble. You should be able to say, I'm sorry, you wronged the kid. All those are central tenets to like our religion. But then when it comes to the culture, for some reason, the trump card or the cap on top is always the sacredness of parents. And parents are like the ultimate authority. And all that kind of comes in and just silences everything else. How do we deal with that, I guess? What's your advice on how to like slowly make progress? If it starts with my generation or whoever, where you say, I feel like I have an awareness, forget my parents, they're never going to see it the way I do. I've tried, they just won't. Culture's too thick, conditioning's too thick. What's your message, I guess, in terms of how to try to make gains in that direction that's more positive?
Well, I would say I want people to start really thinking critically about some of these cultural ideas that we hold that maybe have never even made sense to us, but we continue to hold them because it's what we know, right? So start by really examining some of our own beliefs. And sadly, I'm going to have to push therapy for this one, right? Like, talk to somebody who can help you do that, because I tell people this all the time. I have a job because, people can walk out the door and check their outfit and their hair in a mirror to see how they look to the outside world, but we don't see what our behaviors look like, right? So that's the reason that I have a job, is because that's my role, right? Yeah. And so I think that it starts from examining some of the beliefs that we have, and do they make sense? Have they ever made sense, or are we just doing it because it's what we were told? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I think, to me, the challenge that our community faces uniquely is, and I don't see this with my Christian friends, like, just thinking kind of as I'm going through this right now on the fly with you. I think in our community, there's this sense that fusion between culture and religion is the assumption is that it's a good thing because it maintains religious continuity and like a level of quality control on religion by it being fused with culture generationally. But then also that like the culture has been so informed by the religion that by default the culture is the religion and is good. Like this kind of like melding I don't see that with Christian communities, for example, where like German culture is Christianity, or British, if you're a British immigrant, British culture and Christianity are fused, and therefore, if you're a good Brit, you're a good Christian. It's actually the opposite in a lot of cases. Like, people will say that.
Yeah. With
us, it's not. It's like, oh, if you're a good Muslim, if you're Arab, it strengthens your being a good Muslim, and if you're a Muslim, it's fused in your Arab identity. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, what's really interesting when you bring that up, I think this generation, like, I primarily honestly work with like 20 plus, right? The 20 plus group. I have some that are, around my own age, and then I have a good majority of my clients are in their 20s. And those are the ones that are saying, no, I am no longer, I don't know the English translations for this, so I'm just going to use it in Audible, and you feel free to translate. I'm no longer going to allow for what my parents have taught me as aib to be haram. It's either haram or it's not.
Okay, I got to explain this to people. So aib in Arabic is like one of the most iconic, classic statements that you hear growing up. It's like before anything you teach your kids, Abe. Abe is like shameful or like behavior that's kind of unbecoming of whatever you are. You know, like it's like, oh, don't do that. It's Abe. It's like showing your private parts. That's Abe. You know, get out of the shower, cover yourself up. That's Abe. Don't speak back to your parents. That's Abe. So it becomes this like bandage term for everything.
Yeah.
Right. And so say the statement again that you said. I just wanted to make sure people understood what Abe means, who might not be Arab.
Yeah. So this generation is saying, I am no longer confusing Aib and haram.
And haram being something that's religiously forbidden, sinful.
Yeah. So either it's haram or it's not, and that's how I'm going to live my life. Like, I'm not subscribing to these beliefs that never made sense to me.
Because they're fused in culture.
Yeah.
They're based in culture, not true like religious edict or scripture.
Yes. And I'm just going to say this. There are so many, and more than the opposite, parts of our culture that are absolutely beautiful, right? Like the collectivistic nature of our culture where, you know, we do have genuine care for the next guy, right? Really beautiful parts. But there are some parts that we're just blindly repeating because it's what we were told. It's because it made sense to a generation before us, right? And now it's just been passed down to us. There's actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think this really, like, in my opinion, profound quote that I heard a few months back, and I've really just been, like, sitting on it, right? And it was something along the lines of trauma, when decontextualized in a person, can look like a personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family can look like family traits. And trauma decontextualized in a people can look like a culture. Right?
That's deep.
Right?
That's very deep.
Yeah. And so it really got me thinking how many of these things that we're now calling Abe, or we're now saying, well, this is just how it has to be, but it might not make sense, right? But I'm still going to do it. If it's rooted in trauma, and that trauma is getting passed down, and there's a fear inside of people around it that creates anxiety when something looks different, well, of course we're going to keep doing it. We are far motivated to behave in ways that don't make us feel afraid, right? Or if we're afraid, we're more likely to act than we are to act in ways that make us feel good.
So what you just said really resonated with me. I want to explore this for a second. So, okay, there's a lot going through my head right now. I'm really interested in this. So I think the ironic thing about what you described people thinking is that if we as Muslims look at our religion, one of the most fundamental tenets of our religion that you hear even in scripture, in the Quran, over and over repeated, is that there's a messenger or a prophet that's sent to a people. They're told, believe in one God, abandon the false idols, etc. And one of the first responses of those people back is always, should we abandon that which we found our forefathers upon? Should we turn our backs? There's multiple versions of this in different verses, but essentially in a nutshell, it's something like, hey, we've been doing this for generations, for thousands of years, hundreds of years. Our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather did this, and we're just upon what they were upon. And would you have us turn our backs on all that lineage, that tradition, that culture, right? And to me, what's funny about it is like, the irony is our religion tells us to not have that response to someone being sent a message of goodness and greatness, and calling to God is always to lift you up. But then we're almost doing the same thing as Muslims if we get so steeped in the culture, right? If we sit there and say the culture, and it doesn't actually have Islamic roots or justifications, aren't we in a way just kind of saying, well, I'm just going to stick to what I found my grandfather, my dad, his everyone, I'm just going to keep doing it. And it's almost like you could extrapolate it out to be so much as saying like you're essentially you're erasing or covering up a part of your religion and your thing that you're supposed to be really upholding and attracted to the most in favor of something that's really man-made. It's a man-made, creation or construct. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. It just brought up a thought that I had and an experience. So, in my role, unfortunately, my job doesn't end at the office, right? It's people seem to think that we have good advice to give all the time. And our job, believe it or not, is not to give advice, right? Our job is to what I like to call help people get clear. Help them to make sure that they're not coming from old, hurt parts of themselves and they're looking clearly at what's in front of them, okay? But so I can speak about this because it's not about a client, right? But I had an experience with some just people in my life who, the son started vaping and the dad was a vapor. And so the first time the son vaped in front of the dad got really upset and was like, how dare you vape in front of your father? That's so disrespectful. Mm-hmm. And I had to jump in and say, why? Why isn't it that vaping, which is a health problem, and, probably on the grand scheme of, religiously acceptable or not, it kind of leans towards not. Mm-hmm. Why is that not the focus? And the focus is, it is abe to smoke in front of your father. Mm-hmm. He's like, well, that's what I was taught. And I'm like, but does it make sense? And I think after a while of me continuing to poke, mm-hmm. This person was like, well, maybe, but, that's the best I got was, but maybe, but, right? It didn't make sense. I don't know why it's abe to smoke in front of your father, but that's what I was taught, and I'm going to do that. Where if we were thinking more along the lines of, hey, religiously, like, this isn't really good for you or mm-hmm. me, right? Like, it's not good mm-hmm. for both of us. It's more of, this is what I was taught, and so it has to be. Right.
That's the problem with I think we're dogged by this as a community. If we're just talking now more internally, like between Muslims, even though others could be listening, it's fine. I think we are dogged by this continually. I feel like I see it everywhere, friend groups, family, whatever. It's like, what is culture and what is religion? And not religion in the negative sense, as maybe people who are atheists or agnostic are listening to this going, well, yeah, see, I told you, religion is oppressive. And what I'm going with this is, I think that when people say, man, these religions are oppressive, these religions are so controlling, they're so limiting, I would argue that it's probably culture. Yes. And whether it's family culture, societal culture, whatever group, it's a culture that's oppressive, yes. Not the actual tenets of the faith itself.
Agreed.
Do you see it that way too?
Absolutely agreed. And again, not discrediting the absolutely beautiful parts of, our culture. I think most people will say hospitality, hands down, we've got that.
For sure.
Right. And many, many other beautiful things. But yes, I definitely agree that there are some things that are just rooted in culture that we mix up, and it definitely makes people think that the religion is oppressive, and it's really not. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's counterintuitive, right? You see like people who love Islam, and it empowers their lives and makes such a positive impact. And then you look at someone who has such a negative perception of religion, you're like, what's going on? Like, how could you think it's anything but amazing? And I think you're using two different yardsticks to measure.
100%.
Right? So on culture, we talked about kind of some of the unique things that you've seen, but what about therapy itself? Mm-hmm. What are some of the challenges that you see with culture in terms of people being willing to do therapy? Or being open to therapy, being, like the benefits, I feel like there's probably a lot of stigma around. We talked a little bit about that before, but can you elaborate on some of that?
Yeah, honestly, I am really surprised at how many people are seeking therapy. When I started the practice, there was no part of me that thought Arab would willingly come in, that Muslims would willingly come in. I thought I was really going to have to push. But people ask me all the time, like, where do you advertise? Where are you getting leads, right? I don't. Like, I have a Facebook page, right? That's how big the need is.
Right? So what was your perception or reason for thinking that you wouldn't get people?
Because a lot of my experiences were in the hospital, right? Where I'm telling you, I can count on one hand in years and years that I spent in the hospital setting, how many people of Arab descent or how many Muslims that I saw, in, inpatient psychiatric wards, or even like intensive outpatient programs, which is basically where you go a few days a week for a few hours a day because you need a little more help than just therapy, right? Than just weekly, I'm coming in to go through some of my stuff, right? Literally, I can count on one hand how many of them I saw in years. So I'm like, all right, well, a lot of them just don't go to therapy. They don't get help.
Must be perfect. They must be perfect.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Or I really can't face that I'm not.
Right.
Right?
Probably the latter, I'm guessing. But do you think, what role does spirituality play in that? Like, I feel like for a lot of people, it's probably, if I need therapy, I must not be a good Muslim. That kind of like, right? Like there must be, my iman, my faith must be weak if I need, my spirit, my soul is sullied. That's why I really need to go to the masjid, not to therapy. Okay, do you think that plays a role?
Now we literally need a whole nother podcast, right?
Which is why we'd love to have you back in the future every so often to talk about some of this stuff.
So the sad reality is that, going back to what I said earlier, we are fear-driven and we are safety-motivated, right? We like safety. And a lot of times, religion gives us the ability to feel safe. It gives us a rule book. Check this box and you're okay, right? And so we start to think then, oh my goodness, I'm not okay, so I must not have checked the boxes right. So one of the big things I see in therapy is people who struggle with their prayers, right? Because they're praying over and over and over and over. It's like, oh my God, I don't know if I did enough. I don't know if I missed a part. I don't know. And so they're spending sometimes hours completing one prayer because I didn't check this box, right? And these boxes keep me safe. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Is that OCD too?
Oh, definitely. And this is an interesting thing that I have found as I collect data across the years, right? Number one diagnosis we make at the practice, OCD.
Really?
Yeah.
In this community?
Yeah.
Or in other communities?
No, in this
community. Are the numbers
community
higher in ours?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Tremendously.
This is very interesting. What are your theories as to why?
I think that in part, it is because we are raised with this checkbox idea, right? And OCD, really, it's kind of interesting, right? Because it manifests in ways that don't directly tell you why it manifested. For example, people who, I'm sure you know somebody who incessantly washes their hands, right? And you would think, oh, they're just germaphobes. That's actually the I am responsible wound at play, and how somebody is managing that wound, right? Because some of the idea behind that is, I don't want to cause more suffering. I have to figure out how to manage that. So if I wash my hands all the time, I won't get sick. And if I don't get sick, I won't make them sick. Right?
Interesting, yeah.
And so there's a lot to it. But I think that some of it, and I'm not saying all, but I think that some of it is because we are raised with this idea that if you do all of these things that we're telling you to do, you're going to be okay. And if you don't do those things, you're not okay. And it doesn't necessarily mean physically okay. I want to really stress this. If there's one thing that I want people to really know from this time that we've spent here today, what we do to maintain attachment, right? And what attachment looked like, attachment wounds from our youth, is going to be the thing that's the greatest impact on our lives as adults, right?
So OCD, in a sense, is I needed the framework that I had growing up for attachment and for things to be healthy was that if I had all the 10 things, the list done, I'm good.
Yeah.
And if I don't, if 1-2 things were out of whack or missing, we have a problem.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this obsession about maintaining the checklist.
Yeah, it could be the checklist. It could be other things. Like I said, the hand washing kind of correlates to something else, right? There's, I don't know if you know a lot of people who like double check and, the lights. Oh my God, I don't know if I turned them off. So I got to do it like 3 times to make sure that I turned off the light.
Is that more compulsive behavior or obsessive?
A little bit of both, right? Okay. So the obsession is my brain won't stop thinking about this until I do something compulsively.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that usually comes from this idea that I make mistakes and I get really criticized. So I can't make mistakes. So this is how I'm taking care of the idea of, I won't make a mistake because I'm going to double check. I'm going to triple check. I want to keep checking. This way I avoid criticism. Because what does criticism say to a young kid?
They're not enough.
Yeah. And if you're not enough, why would your parents want you? Why would they want to take care of you, right?
Yeah.
We don't know when we're kids. I mean, as adults, we can sit here and say, well, that's crazy. Of course, when we're mad at our kids doesn't mean we don't love them or don't want them. But little kids don't have the language for that. They don't know that, right? They only have what they have as far as knowledge, and it usually comes right back to them, right? So this is how they figure out how to be okay.
And I think there are a lot of people out there probably, again, to just on this one, play a little bit of devil's advocate and to see what your take on it is people, myself included, I think I have an OCD personality on certain things. I feel like when I apply it, it can be a positive for me. Like in adulthood, it's helped in my work. And, people say, hey, I'm an amazing, whatever, professional because I don't miss a thing. I don't this, I'm perfectionist. You hear it in these are the spins of like trying to sell people on OCD. I'm perfectionist. I do, I'm high functioning, A-type personality. What's your, I can see you just already just like, sure you get this.
I'm gonna refer back to our good friend Gabor, right? And in his book, When the Body Says No, he has chapters on the autoimmune personality, which we're seeing a huge spike in these days, right? Especially in the 20-something-year-olds. I can't tell you how many clients I have that have some kind of an autoimmune disease, right? We're seeing a lot of lupus. We're seeing a lot of IBD, so like Crohn's and colitis. We're seeing a lot of rheumatoid arthritis in, this younger generation that we weren't seeing before, right? And so I'm wondering how, I'd like to hear your thoughts about this. How do you think that having this OCD, which ultimately is, oh my God, I have a lot of anxiety, this is the only way that I can calm it, but you know as well as I do, right, that it only lasts for a very brief period of time.
Well, I think...
So, health-wise, how do we...
I think I had a recent experience around stress and anxiety to a degree. I think it was anxiety related where I think it started to manifest in terms of physical symptoms, and I think what happened, if I look back, for the amount of it that was truly anxiety related and not some other stimulus that I haven't been able to identify, I think that you have a checklist, you have an OCD, and for me, it's not compulsion with shutting lights off or things like that where I get stuck in like closing a car door. I've heard of examples where people experience that. For me, it was more like the perfectionist, like everything has to be done perfectly. I like clutter-free, no messes. I like things to be, sharp and almost not military. I wouldn't go to that extreme, but, I want to walk into a room and not see clutter and a mess. I'm very organized. Time management has always been a strength of mine, being able to really, stick to a plan and execute it well. So for me, I think I got so obsessed with the checklist and the OCD about getting these things done. Usually it reduces your anxiety. So you go on a roller coaster ride, right? It goes up, your checklist, OCD comes in, you get all your checklist done. Now you feel great. Like, I knocked out the day. And that a lot of times that's our work cycle every day. It's like, my week, okay, Friday, I'm done. Everything's under control. But I think for me, I went through a period where it just kept building up and my stress became more focused on the process and the fact that I was just chasing this list, that it created its own level of stress that just kept building and I never got the down cycle. And I think it put me into a situation where I had some physical manifestations for the first time in my life of true like stress and like anxiety attack. And like, so I think that it can be extremely like problematic. I mean, it was crippling to a degree for a while there. I was like, my God, what's going on? Because the OCD thing got out of control.
Yeah.
And so, but it's interesting as far as why it's, and then I guess to finish out my point was that brings on the physical manifestations, possibly like what you're saying. You said all kinds of physical symptoms could be felt because of anxiety, right? And I think this is maybe something to talk about as our next point is like, do people realize, I certainly didn't, that you could have anxiety, emotional, mental anxiety or feelings that then manifest in physical symptoms?
Yes, but, I am very careful to use the term like psychosomatic.
Okay.
Right? Which means, oh, you're only feeling your stress. No, your stress does create physical change in your body, right? And like, I guess in the therapeutic sense, when we think about stress, one of the definitions that I think makes the most sense to me is that stress is the perception that our inability to cope with what's going on has depleted. Right?
Say that again.
That stress is our perception that our ability to cope has depleted.
And that's a misnomer, or that's the reality?
I think that's the reality. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. That would make sense. From my experience, it was like I reached a limit. I was burned out from being obsessed about the OCD aspect, the checklist, and getting things done and on to,
And so I'm gonna have you running out of here to buy that Gabor Mate book,
Sure.
the Myth of Normal, because one of the stories in there that really was just like, wow, was he talked about this case of a 15-year-old girl who went somewhere with her friends, and then, this is terrible, but she ended up getting gang raped while she was out. And she runs home, right? And it's like, Mom, right? This is what happened. So Mom's like, get in the shower right now. And she's like, Mom, scrubbing her, right? And, at first she was like, oh, Mom really cares. She's trying to make me feel better. And as soon as she was done, she goes, you speak about this to no one. This didn't happen. And she's like, the sudden surge of shame through my body, all I felt was fire in my stomach, right? And years later develops Crohn's disease, which is an irritable bowel disease, right? Inflammatory bowel disease, right? That every time she has a flare-up, that burn comes back.
Wow.
Right? And shame, which is what she felt that day, is the trigger for her flare-ups.
So it truly can be, I mean, that's amazing for it to be something. I thought maybe like, you think of like The Sopranos, like the stereotypical therapy, like Tony Soprano is, that whole thing he was going through in that, for those who know the show.
Yeah.
But like, panic attacking, shortness of breath, I'm having a little bit of dizziness, I'm getting really worked up. Not something like IBS or Crohn's or something like truly like a chronic condition that impacts your digestive system.
Yes.
Like what, you know what I mean?
Because that is the danger zone, right? Your stomach is the danger zone. And now you're adding this belief, because when you think about really what becomes trauma, it's what happened to you, but also the belief and the meaning you attach to it, right?
Interesting. I think that's shocking to a lot of people probably. Like I think understanding that can be that potent and that like where you're feeling the symptoms and you're like, man, I think I have cancer. Or I think I have kidney failure. I mean, people get worked up and scared and worried, and then ultimately you go through, I've heard stories, people go through tests. You're fine. You're fine. There's nothing wrong with you. We've done everything. Your kidneys, your liver, your metabolic panel, we've done lipid panel, every panel imaginable, plus MRI, CT scan. I mean, people go through a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, everything, heart looks great. Everything looks great. No, you don't have fatty liver. No, you don't have this. No, you don't have that. Yeah. And they're like, but something's wrong. Something's going on. And it can be something that is harder actually than dealing with the physical sometimes, is like.
Oh, definitely. I've
the
had
emotional or psychological.
Once it becomes like a diagnosable condition, it gets a little harder to work with, right? But I have a lot of people coming in with digestive issues is probably the number one, right? Thing that people come in with physical complaints. And once we rule out, because that's kind of my first go-to, is you have to get a full medical workup. Because I'm not going to be messing with your feelings if there's something going on that was happening before we start talking about your feelings. And then you kind of want to be careful with what kind of feelings you're touching, right? And believe it or not, it's actually really interesting. There's like a few therapeutic techniques that you can't even use with pregnant women.
Really?
Yeah.
Because there's a risk to the unborn
fetus.
Wow.
Right? Because again, that baby is highly
sensitive.
susceptible. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you, like what? Do you have
So are you familiar with EMDR? Okay, it's called eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Okay.
And so ultimately we use eye movements or some kind of what we call bilateral stimulation. So it could be like we have people hold buzzers in their hands and one will buzz and then the other and then, right? And so what that does is it allows you to bring up really old memories that were really painful. We figure out the attached belief and we work to reprocess that memory. But it is intense, right?
The process of just going through that therapy is intense.
Oh, yeah.
To where it can impact the fetus.
I mean, it's intense enough where I remember when I was doing the training for this therapy, it's always experiential, right? So we have to play the client and then we play the therapist for someone and they play our client. And they were like, don't do anything too big because we're not each other's real therapists, right? We don't need to trigger too bad, but just choose something. I chose something super, what I thought was benign in the moment. And within about 3 minutes, I was like, we're stopping. This is going to places that I didn't even realize were in there, right? And so for a pregnant woman to have those like shocks can be a little dangerous, right? So we're not even allowed to do that on pregnant women, right?
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, so what role does age play or time in bringing that out, eliciting that response? Because I feel like for me, the experience I went through was that for most of my life and the majority of my life, I never had a fear or concern that anything emotional or psychological could manifest physically at all. And then all of a sudden you hit an age where it does, or an experience that does. Do you think that as you get older, I don't know if it's like even a thing, like your psychological bulletproofness or capacity for resilience, maybe is a better word, wears thin? Or is it regardless of age, it can just happen?
No, I think regardless of age, it can just happen, right? And like one thing that I do pretty much with all of my clients, right, is at least at some point in every session, I have them kind of what I call like turn inwards. Like just notice what's happening in your body. Notice if you have any spots of tension, right? And let's kind of give that spot a moment to tell its story if it has one, or, right? Just let it know, hey, I see you. Because a lot of wounds are invisibility wounds. I wasn't seen, right? So if you actually tend to that wound, that can start the healing process. So I say I do it with pretty much every client, and I let them know when they sit down. I'm like, I'm not a venting kind of therapist, because it's funny, you mentioned it earlier, and I wanted to say something about that. Venting is like a pressure cooker, right? Have you ever used a pressure cooker or familiar with how they work? You know, they have that little vent where it releases steam, and it releases just enough steam that the pot doesn't explode, but what's in it keeps cooking.
Right.
So that's what venting lets us do. We complain about what's going on. Now it's like, oh, okay, I relieved enough pressure where I can just go back to this bad situation.
It doesn't really resolve it. It
No.
doesn't fix the issue underlying.
No, right? And I also wanted to touch on what you mentioned about panic attacks, because I think there's a lot of misconception around what those are too. People are like, well, yeah, I just had a panic attack. No, you didn't randomly have a panic attack. At some point in your life, something happened that you should have panicked about, right? Somebody broke into your home, God forbid, right? You should panic. You absolutely should panic, right? So now, later in life, things happen that trigger that moment. Now you're panicking, right?
Yeah.
So panic attacks don't just happen. They have a root.
How difficult is it okay, so if you have a ideal, you call them a patient or client?
Client.
Yeah. You have an ideal client that is like open book, willing to cooperate with therapy. Like they're not like antagonistic toward, oh, my wife forced me to therapy. I hate this. This is stupid. Not that kind of person that you see on TV, but like a person who's like, hey, I believe in this, that I'm willing to do this. How hard is it to get them to identify what it is that caused it? A combative person, let's just forget that, because that's going to take a lot of time just to get them to trust therapy and all that. But someone who's willing to get to the bottom of it, how difficult is that?
I mean, honestly, I've had some clients that they leave from their first session and then they have family members feeling upset because, like, how did you learn so much in one session? I've been doing this for years and
Really?
Yeah. And so I would say that there are some people who are like learning, but therapy is a process. And I tell people this all the time. When they walk in my door, this is not short term. The kind of therapy I do is not short term. There is some therapy out there that is really like, I'm going to teach you coping skills so that you can just keep doing what you're doing, right? You need to manage situations a little better. Here's how to do it. I'm more of like what I call a root canal kind of therapist, right? We're going to rip the root out so that you don't suffer from this anymore.
So you are kind of like if people have seen The Sopranos, like the deep dive. Dr. Is it Melfi? Right?
Yeah.
So the Dr. Melfi, like get what people dream of as being the therapy session. Who want therapy? Like we're not going to go in and you're just going to, we're going to get to the root and we're going to figure you out and we're going to prop you up. And hopefully when you get out, when you're done with your therapy, you're going to be a better person in terms of dealing with them, whatever they've got going on.
Well, yeah, step one is learning about yourself. Step one is learning what makes you tick, right? And that alone takes sometimes years just to really learn. I mean, you are learning how to manage during that time, right? But becoming aware of what makes you tick is step one, right? And that's, in my opinion, that's the fun part.
Yeah. That self-discovery is very interesting. It's very rewarding, eye-opening,
Yeah.
Because we operate without like the boot programming written down. We have boot programming from childhood, like you're saying, but to actually see the code, it's like a programmer who could read like, C++ or whatever these programming language. I'm not a coder, and they can like see, I'm like, oh, I see it all. It's like the Matrix, the green letters,
The aha moments, as we call them in therapy. That's what we live for, right? That's how, like, therapy is a really hard kind of profession because it's not like other jobs. Like, I completed this project and, I did well on it. And I know I did well because of,
the rocket
these
didn't
measurable.
crash.
Yeah. Right? In therapy, it's really hard because how do you know? Right? And so those aha moments are how we know sometimes, right? Where somebody's like, oh my God, yeah, that I felt that, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
So a couple other questions I have around, we talked about kind of bringing us back a little bit to now the continuation and still on therapy. What would be the advice to people who are interacting with someone who clearly, like, you think this person needs therapy? We all know people like that. We're like, this person, maybe we all need therapy, but I'm saying like, this is like extreme. Like this person needs help. What is your advice for people dealing with family members, friends, other people in the community where you're like, I can't force them to go. They're an adult. I'm an adult. But how do we interact with them in a way that maybe brings out a better outcome or relationship?
So that's an interesting one. I think it depends on, number one, what's going on with the person. And then this is again where I sometimes see cultural, restraints around getting help for people who really need it, right? If we're talking about some pretty serious struggles, right? Like somebody with unmanaged bipolar disorder, for example, they could really be dangerous to themselves, right? There's a lot of impulsivity around there. And if they're not willing to go get help and you really are fearing for their safety, then the reality is that sometimes you have to go to court, right? But if we're talking about like a lower level, like their behaviors are really like, they're not maintaining a job or they're fighting with everybody.
Verbally abusive, stuff like that.
Like
stuff
all
that's
of
more,
those things,
they can still function. They're maybe even high functioning, but they have these problems where with people, it's a real issue.
Yeah, well, I always would recommend two things for family members. Number one, the family member recommending that person go to therapy should be in therapy, right? To help them learn how to better manage their relationship with that family member. And then the other part of it is really good boundaries, right? And I don't know if we need a tutorial on boundaries, but if you'd like.
We have time.
So boundaries are two parts. Number one, it is instructions for how I want to be shown love. Okay. Right? And another part of it is I matter, but I can also honor what you need. Right? So even in the case of somebody struggling with unmanaged bipolar disorder and having a manic episode and just really being mean to people and acting recklessly, right? every single disorder in the DSM, which is the book that we use to diagnose any kind of mental health struggles, right? If you look at what the purpose is, it is to help manage a part of us that feels scared, okay? So bipolar disorder says sometimes I get really chaotic and sometimes I get really sad and shut down. And that's how I manage the fear in me. I avoid what's scaring me, or I create so much distraction and, chaos in my life. And it usually has something to do with what we're scared of, right? I mean, it's a whole long story I could explain to you one day if you'd like of why, but...
no, go ahead. I mean, go a little bit more into it.
So one of the key characteristics, I would say, of bipolar disorder is what we call grandiosity, right? Is this inflated sense of self, like, oh, I can do this, and I'm going to be more successful than this, and I am better than this, right? And what is that usually covering the fear of, right? Inferiority.
Inferiority or failure.
Yeah, right? And so even in cases like that, I'm going to be really honest, I'm not big on medications for any long term, because in my humble opinion, and research is starting to support this, that a good majority of mental health struggles are 100% experiential based, right? But in the case of somebody doing things like acting recklessly, being verbally abusive, it's setting boundaries, right? Like, I really care for you and your well-being, but if this happens, this is what's going to come of it, right?
So how do we, as a community that we were talking about earlier, has this strong preference towards dutifulness to parents and parents being sacred, balance that with boundaries? So like, let's say if you're people out there who might be struggling with a parent, let's say, or parents that have certain behaviors, right? How do you balance between boundaries, but knowing that like you want to convey the message that you love them, you respect them, you cherish them, you want to have the best relationship possible, but because you can't control them, maybe will never, like, let's say it's just a dream to ever imagine them going to therapy. They will never do it, whatever. But you can't control their behavior. But you want to have the best relationship possible while still keeping yourself protected, right? So, have you seen that struggle where it's like, my parents, I need boundaries, but I also need to be the dutiful son, daughter, whatever. How do I negotiate this? Well, with knowing that your faith also promotes you being like the dutiful son or daughter to the death in terms of how culturally we interpret the faith.
Over and over and over again, right? I hear this struggle. And I will often say, the Orland Park Masjid is a mile behind me, literally. So I will say, look, I'm not qualified to give you this information. I have an understanding, but I don't want to misinform. That's not my wheelhouse, right? Walk back a mile, talk to somebody there, come back and we can talk about it, right?
Yeah.
And I have sent a lot of clients over to say, hey, my mom is really hurting me like this. My dad is really hurting me like this. And with some level of consistency, they have been told that it's okay to have boundaries, right?
Meaning they were talking about Islamically.
Yeah.
An imam or a clergyman, for those who may not know the terminology, is telling them it's okay to have boundaries. It's not, you're not sinning or being undutiful because you have to set limits.
Yes. And then they really kind of break down what the idea of respect is, right? You don't raise your voice. You don't use foul language. Here's what you're actually responsible for. So I do think that maybe there just needs to be a little bit of clarification on what it means to be dutiful, right?
Interesting.
And so that's one part of it. I think the other part of it then comes back to, and what I'm seeing a big struggle, is that people don't know how to take care of themselves. We don't. It doesn't feel okay. There's like a really big guilt associated to, I can't keep doing this. This is really hurting me. I'm physically feeling it at this point, right?
Yeah.
I'm on the verge of losing my mind and I can't do anything about it. I have to take it, right? And so almost always I have found that there's something deeper there when people feel that way. They've somehow felt a tremendous guilt when they were younger at the idea of letting themselves matter, right?
Yeah.
And again, letting yourself matter doesn't mean you have to disrespect or dishonor anyone else.
And also, I think, thinking about it for myself, like, your self-mattering, if you want to think about it in a more transactional way for some people, maybe, you can't be a good father. You can't be a good husband. You can't be a good wife. You can't be a good mother. All the rest, if you're not taken care of.
Yes.
So it's actually selfish. It's counterintuitive, right? It's selfish to not take care of yourself. It's not that you're selfish because you want to take care of yourself, because it's the harder thing to do.
Yeah.
And it's easier just to be like, oh no, forget about me for now, whatever. But in doing so, I mean, I've witnessed, like I said, something kind of not on a huge scale, but smaller scale in my own life recently, where it's like, if you don't take care of yourself, you can't be all the roles that everyone else depends on you to be that are critical to them. You'll fail in all the other, like as a father, as a husband. You can end up impacting your relationships and even work. You could lose your job.
Yeah.
I mean, in extreme cases.
Oh, yeah.
So it's important to think about it that way, right? Like it's not selfish. It's actually selfish to not deal with these things.
So I want you to
put
think
others at
about,
risk.
there's 3 components to this, okay? There's selfish, selfless, and having a sense of self, right? We don't want to be selfish or selfless. We don't want to not care about anybody at all. We don't want to,
Forget ourselves.
We want to be somewhere in that middle, right?
What's the middle called again?
The sense of self.
Sense of self.
Yeah.
Not selfish, not selfless. Sense of self.
And so I think that what we do that causes us a lot of pain is confuse that sense of self with selfish, right? And any act of kindness that we show ourselves feels selfish. Something that I often will tell clients is that, especially the ones who are parents, this really hits. Our job as an adult isn't just to parent our child. You always want to see however many kids you have and then +1, because your inner child needs reparenting, right? True healing comes from reparenting your inner child, which oftentimes is as simple as, what do I need? How do I let that matter? Right?
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
And especially because I think a lot of people go on the exploration of their inner self, child self, as you call it, later on in life.
Yeah.
Like when they've already done a lot of like maybe the damage to like little kids.
Yeah.
Like, if people had their kids, like say in their 20s, we had our kids started in our 20s too. It's like, was I self-aware enough? I was more consumed with realizing I had these issues, discovering the dysfunction, the problems, the things inherited generationally, whatever, but I didn't have my solutions yet.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I was in my 30s, mid to late 30s now, where it's like, oh, I'm starting to feel like I've got some control and understanding of some of this stuff, and I've built myself up better.
Yeah.
But now your kids are already 11, 12, 13. Like
They already suffered.
They already
some of
went
that.
through probably some negative effect of you not being that aware.
Well, I'm going to shout this from the rooftops, right? While, we have until about 7 or 8 years old to give our kids the most, like the research says that like usually by about 6, about 80% of like the significant traumatic things that happen to a person have already happened, right? And after that, there's still trauma to be had, right? But it's just because your brain is developing in different ways that it's not going to be as easy to traumatize a child as you would when they're 6 or under, right? So a lot of the hard work is in those early years. What I will say is that never, 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 and I've said this already, but I'm going to say it again, is it's so important, underestimate the value of an apology when you've had the realization. Hey, I didn't know better. I really did the best I could with what I knew at the time. And I can't tell you the change that I see in clients whose parents have been able to do that for them, or clients who have been able to do it for their children and the change that they've seen in their children, right?
That's interesting. It's powerful because I think that the apology piece, and we talked about culture, we talked about the child-parent relationship, especially in adulthood. I think a lot of cultures out there, not just Arab or Muslim cultures, have this, the elder is sacred. Don't talk back, don't this, don't that. And I think it's just it wastes so much time. Like the other thing I've seen in my life personally is like, we have in Islam the Surah Al-Asr, right? Al-Asr and Insana fi khusr. We read this a lot. People read this every day in their prayers. That time. we only have the time we have, and we don't know how much of it there is.
Yeah.
Any one of us could go any day.
Yeah.
You know? So I guess for me, it's always thinking about that. Like, do I want to waste time having a fake or dysfunctional or a facade-ish relationship? Or do I want to get to the core and have the best relationship, the most valuable time with that person possible? And I think about my kids, I think of it in terms of giving an apology or saying sorry can go a long way. Why not? Like, why not do it? Just do it. Like,
it sounds so easy.
yeah.
But do you know one of the hardest things that I have a lot of clients that talk about, well, I can't even give my kid a hug. Like that physical connection just feels so scary or uncomfortable for me, right?
To the parent giving their kid a hug.
Yeah. And some of it is, at the end of the day, what's familiar to us is comfortable, right? And so if our childhood was, lacking that physical affection or those kind words or whatever, right, then it feels really uncomfortable, even as an adult, to get it from
like
someone
awkward.
else.
I've experienced it with certain people too.
Yeah.
Like, it's not everyone. There's some people where I feel like I'm more affectionate and physically able to be connected to and like hug and kiss, like, like kids for sure.
Yeah.
But in general, I'm saying there are people where you feel like it's awkward.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be with that, given their proximity to you, they're a close family member or whatever, but you're like, it's awkward to be physically touchy-feely with this person versus someone else.
So anytime the word shouldn't comes up, I always say explore that a little deeper, right? Because that's a judgment. So why shouldn't it be? It is. It just is, right? It just is. So why is it? That's my thing. My big push, the way that I do therapy, my big push is we're ditching the labels at the door, right? No should or shouldn't, no good or bad, no right or wrong. We need to understand, right? We're working towards understanding. And so my thought is I would like maybe for you, and you can do it later, right, is to think about, why am I saying I shouldn't? Why do I feel this way? That's more important than labeling that.
I see what
right?
you're saying. Interesting, yeah. See, you just did the aha moment thing for me.
Well, and I had a good day.
Right on YouTube in front of everyone. It worked. So we've been talking a lot about how are you doing in terms of time and in terms of energy. Okay. You're good. We talked a lot about like generational and parents and children and stuff, but I think there's a juicy topic that a lot of people want to dive into, which is couples. You said you specialize in that. One question that I had a lunch conversation with a colleague at the office last week actually about this, so I wanted to run it by you. Why is it, here's the question, I wanted like my direct reports at work who work for me, and then also some other colleagues to like just have a discussion about it. It was kind of nerdy, but we did it anyway. Was why is it that when I walk in the door at home after a long day, my 3-year-old, like I can get on my knees, hug and kiss him, adore him, all the rest, but that same level of pure affection is different with your spouse. Why is, what can you talk a little bit about that? And that might be just a segue question into everything couples related.
So many reasons though, right? And it's hard to pinpoint exactly what. A lot of it comes back to our upbringing, right? Were you witnessing a lot of affection between your parents? Is that something that felt okay, right? Have you developed this idea, which again, I think is cultural because religiously it's actually, encouraged.
Recommended, encouraged,
right?
Valued. Yeah, absolutely.
Right? But is it cultural? No, it's, again, here comes the A word, right?
Yeah.
To do. And is there something inside of us that feels like, no, we can't do that because it's something that we learned?
Yeah, because it wasn't just me. Like at first I was nervous. Like I put it out on the table. There were probably like 6 people sitting there. And I was thinking, I'm going to out myself as like, they think like I come home and I'm just like terrible towards my spouse. And every one of them, there was guys and girls, even the girls, they were saying towards their husbands, and guys towards their wife, like we're saying, they started laughing. They were like, that's so true. And so it resonated, and it told me that there's like an underlying truth there that's like, probably a lot of people have this problem where my kids, I could just get hugged. How are you today? How was your day at school? But that same level, people would go like, yeah, in our first 6 months of marriage or during our honeymoon phase, that's how it was with my spouse. But quickly rubbed off and it was over, and it was like it's back into the grind pretty fast in terms of, banging out the years with a spouse.
Well, I'm gonna put something out there, and maybe don't answer, so that if your spouse is seeing this, it's not gonna get you in trouble, right? But I also want to start thinking about, who do we feel the most inclined to be affectionate towards, right? Is the person that we're going to get positive reinforcement from, right? The person that seems happy that we showed up, happy to see us, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think for some people, we were sitting at the table, you know, like I was trying to digest it myself. I'm going like, I got home, I'm happy to be home, happy to be done with work, whatever, happy to see the kids, haven't seen them all day.
Yeah.
I'm happy to see my spouse, but it's almost like the way you show it is different for some versus others, or the way you're conditioned, maybe you would say, to deal with that person is just, I mean, how would you interpret that?
Well, let me ask a question, right? When we get home from work, what starts then? When we start communicating with our spouse, what starts?
I'd say a habit or pattern of, like, you know, non-work, like I'm Omar, if those who don't know. So non-work Omar comes out, right? You kind of get into it. You shift gears. That was my work Omar. There's my commute, podcast, obsessed, digestive Omar. And then there's, I just pulled into the driveway Omar.
And then you get into what mode? What do you talk about with your spouse?
Well, I think it's preconditioned habits of, I don't know. It's like a decompressive phase maybe for me, like of quiet, like, or I want to be left alone. Maybe that's part of it. I feel like, when I've thought about it deeply, like I just like, with the kids, they won't understand that, but maybe my spouse would, or maybe I get away with it with my spouse where, I don't know. It's probably not a good thing, but I'm saying it's like decompress. I want quiet, leave me alone. Then when I get my head on straight after a long day, now I'm ready to re-engage. Whereas with kids, they don't necessarily, you just give them a hug and a kiss, and then, you know, they run off.
So there's no expectation on me after this.
Yeah, perhaps.
Right? Because that's one thing that I'm guilty of, right? As soon as me and my husband reconnect for the day. Did you do this? No, I forgot. Oh, we still have to do this? Oh, I need this, right? And so there's like a sense of almost like, oh, now I turned off my work brain and everything I had to do there. Now I got to turn on the home brain and everything that needs to get done here, right?
It's not over.
No,
the list keeps growing. Yeah.
Right. And so now sometimes people start associating seeing my spouse with more to do, right? So there's a lot of different reasons why we could be experiencing that. But the first place I would always have people explore is, what's your experience with parents showing affection, right?
Yeah. I could see that a lot too.
Yeah.
Being a big impact for people. Yeah. And with couples, so we talked a lot about generational stuff. Can you give a little bit of some examples in terms of dysfunction, problems, therapy themes for our community when it comes to couples versus parent-child? We've talked about a lot, but like, what about a couple things that could be either rooted in culture or... I'm sure the list is just huge.
No, I'm going to go back to the good old T word. Trauma, right? Unmet needs from our childhood, particularly as it pertains to our unmet needs with our mother, is what we're going to bring into our relationship. It's actually really interesting, right? Because I could know a client for years. They're like, well, you're doing pretty decently, until the minute they get into a relationship. And then that's when you really start seeing all of the pain manifest in different ways, right? And so I often tell people that's why you need to go to premarital, right? Because you need to understand each other's traumas and triggers, because they're going to come up in the relationship. And hopefully you've done some work around them, but by the time you're coming to get married, but I hate to say it, the thing that drives most people to therapy is marital conflict. I would say especially for me, right? Yeah. Whether I'm seeing a person individually because they're trying to make the marriage better, or the couples, or even when people are coming in, what's your chief complaint? Well, I'm struggling in my marriage, right? It's huge. And the reason that I think a lot of marriages are falling apart is because people think that when their partner does something that doesn't feel good to them, like, you hurt me, instead of what I said earlier, no, you touched something in me that already hurt. What you did reminded me of this really painful thing, right?
Yeah,
so now if you think somebody in your life is constantly hurting you, what's the natural consequence of that?
fight or flight kicks in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then a lot of resentment and, that's why we're seeing a lot of marriages not go so well.
Can I ask a possibly sensitive question with our community and culture, but I got to say it. I got to throw it out there.
Yeah.
And this is just off the cuff. Like, I could see people out there going, how is it that you said the relationships, and a lot of it ties back to our relationships with our mothers.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of people in our community, their mothers were housewives, right? Whether back home in another country or if they're immigrant, second, third generation, a lot of them are housewives. They're not working professionals. They're not the wife of, what's the game of, House of Cards. There's the senator, the evil senator on House of Cards, that show. And there's that, what's her name? Robin Wright. There's the actress that plays the high functioning wife of the guy who's really so capable. She could take out Washington if she wanted to. Most of our mothers weren't that like high grade, super uber professional, power trippy kind of like person. They were a housewife. They had a very routine schedule. In your opinion, how is it that someone like that archetype could inflict so much dysfunction on generations of children and have them having relationships? I mean, obviously it's interpretive, but I'm saying, can you, I think like, okay, a lovely little housewife for a mother. Like, what could she have done to those kids to cause so many problems?
Oh, man. So again, it's the interpretation of what's going on, not necessarily what's going on that causes the issue. It's the perception and the meaning that we make out of it. So if, for example, you are the child of a really critical mother and it seems like nothing you can do is right, okay? Then anytime a wife simply says, oh, hey, did you forget to take out the garbage last night? That's going to touch that old painful spot of the criticisms we got from mom. Because again, remember, mom criticizes. It means she might not love us. It means what if she doesn't take care of us? What's going to happen, right? Because remember, human beings need their parents for longer than any other species in existence, right? You can go take a cat from a shelter right now at 6 weeks old, put it with a non-cat family, and it's fine, right? A 16-year-old human can't function without their parents. Let's be real, right?
Yeah, especially today's 16-year-olds.
Literally.
Yeah.
So we need our parents for survival. That's just matter of fact, right? So if we're tying these things to survival, you're going to have a really big, like fight or flight kind of a response. And sadly, in marriage, a lot of people choose to fight, but flight looks like avoidance, just kind of going quiet, disengaging, right?
Yeah.
And so now if you have a fighter and a flighter, the fighter is like, oh my God, this is so, important and I need this resolved because it really hurts me. And then the person that's running away is like, oh, I can't handle this. This is how I need to cope right now. Do you see how that could?
Yeah.
It can really send messages that aren't true that, oh, they don't care. You don't care that I'm scared and running away. You don't care that I'm so upset that I'm, in this state and begging you to talk.
Right.
Right? Yeah. Again, we're coming from here. We don't come from here. And that's what I push hard to couples is that you need to know that you cannot engage for at least 20 minutes after you've been triggered, sometimes up to 24 hours.
And you said that in our community, there's a definitely, we have an aversion to taking criticism. Like earlier, you were saying that's like a huge problem for us. Like, you don't criticize me. I can't take the criticism, whatever. Maybe there's ego and respect and all these other conditions associated with it. But then you said something right now that made me think of, you said that, criticizing with the mother relationship, if you had a really critical mother, do you think there could be a connection there where like maybe we're so sensitive to criticism because we're the community that talks the most crap for like we're the ones criticizing the most? Like, could we just be critical of everyone around us so much? We're so verbal. Arabs are very like verbose, very like Mediterranean culture. Italians are like this. Greeks are like this. Is it that we're boisterous and we're critical of and not afraid to like share our opinion of everyone around us, and then that perpetuates the cycle where we're also very sensitive to criticism? Or
I think there's a little bit culturally to that, right? That we are a little more vocal, okay? But I also, and I promise you this has got to be its own session because this is such a big topic. I want to think about specifically Palestinians, Okay, if we're talking about generational trauma.
Sure.
So that means that oppression is weaved into us, right? And doesn't oppression already say you're less than,
For
right?
sure.
Because that's what the experiences are, right? So now, we're passing that along our genes, right? It's already in there. And then we grow up in homes, and I think that this is what I hear a lot in our community. We're not told, hey, just wake up tomorrow and be a better version of yourself than you were today. Or you're great just how you are, right? A lot of what I hear is people being told, look at your cousin, look at so-and-so's kid, look at your brother or sister, right? So then what does that mean, right? What does that start telling
Feelings
us?
of inadequacy, feelings of failure,
Less than, right? Inferiority.
Right.
So even when we talk about things around ego is a cover for inferiority, right? And sometimes we develop this idea that I can't be good enough unless I'm better than XYZ, right? And so I think sometimes the criticism comes from just that.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And maybe the fact of being Palestinian or being part of a group that's dealing with this like cosmic level political / conflict level, what do you want to call it? Political crisis. Honestly, it's a societal crisis, an identity crisis, an ethnic crisis, it's on so many levels, right? In terms of identity being erased, you've got this continuing occupation that's been going on for 75 plus years, where, your history is under threat, your identity or, your status, literally your visa. A lot of these people are stateless who never were able to get citizenship in a Western country or some other diaspora group, right, area. They're like, I don't even have the ability to be deported because they don't know what country I'd be deported to because I'm stateless.
Yeah.
That whole phenomenon. So people are under attack from all these different angles. And then for people to then have to figure out how to manage that in terms of their own psychology, it's a lot to ask, to be fair, to be soft on us a little bit. I'm saying I think it's very much like cutting edge to even start to like unravel some of this because of just a lack of awareness and understanding historically.
Hence the reason why I say therapy is it's really a lifelong process, but true change happens in several years, right? And there's something really powerful about being able to look within and acknowledge what is and isn't yours, right? And I know I'm throwing a lot of books at you, but a really great book that kind of speaks to that is It Didn't Start With You.
It Didn't Start With You.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the author off the top of my head.
We'll look it up and we can confirm.
Yeah, but that's a really great book that talks about exactly that. It talks about how to start working on identifying what things you're carrying that might not even be yours.
Yeah, I think that with on the issue of being Palestinian, and we talked about at the very beginning of this silence.
Yeah.
I think for me, the most traumatic part, right, when I look at myself and say, what is it that really triggers me in any setting is, and it feeds into something else that I wanted to ask you about towards the end, is imposter syndrome. And it's something that I've suffered from, and I think a lot of people out there have suffered from. But when you're always silenced and you're not given a microphone and you always have to kind of bite the bullet, let that one slide, whether it's someone saying something that they shouldn't, something derogatory, racist, bigoted, whatever. Growing up in this country where a lot of people just have blind spots. They don't even know they're doing it and saying something to you or reacting to something and the news in front of you. And you're like, oh my God, this person is such an ignoramus. They have no clue what they're talking about. And they're listening to Fox News right now, that kind of thing. And you're just used to being silent, and not having a voice on TV. Nothing mainstream covers it. Now it's new because of the whole explosion of this whole Gaza situation over the last couple of years. But I think there's something unique about a group, and I think Jewish people probably went through the same thing, according to their own historians and scholars and social scientists or whatever coming out of World War II. So I guess my question is kind of twofold. One. If you're a Palestinian and you're going through this, and whether it's a crisis of identity, dealing with identity, whether you've seen war or not, what's your advice to those people in terms of why it's so important for them to be in therapy would be one. And the other piece is, how do you get people who are not Palestinian to kind of have some insight as like, what would you say what would your message to those people who are not Palestinian be about this group? That, you don't want to put a group on a pedestal and act like they're entitled to anything, because that's a big trigger word for a lot of people nowadays is entitlement. But how would you kind of advise people around this?
So again, I would go back to the whole Gabor Mate idea. Are they open to another perspective, right? I hope she doesn't mind that I kind of put her out there, but of my 4 therapists that are not Muslim or Arab descent, most of them are Palestinian, okay? But out of the 4, one of them was, has always been very aware and pro, Palestinian liberation. Another one of them is also very, maybe a little less outspoken than the one. But then I did have one who came in on October 7th and said to me directly, I don't know what to make of this. Right? And if I'm going to be honest, it took everything in me to not lose my marbles, right? Because I'm already deteriorating at the idea of everything that's about to be, because we all knew it was going to come, right? And I said to her, I don't have the capacity to teach you. I need you to go find your own resources of how to make sense of this for yourself. And so luckily she had some people in her life that were very, informed, and she went and she learned and she came back and she was like tearfully apologetic, right? And so I think that we stand a better chance if there's people in our lives that already know us. I think they're more willing to listen. But if we're trying to do it for people on the street, right? I think something that I remind myself of to try to calm myself down is there are just a lot of scared people out there, right? Maybe they're not terrible, horrible, awful, right? Maybe they are just really scared. We've been told this is how to keep yourself safe, support this, abide by this, and you're going to be safe. And so they think that opening up to the idea that, the Palestinians have been oppressed, that what's happening to them is not okay, makes them unsafe, right? Not excusing, not justifying, simply explaining, right?
And a lot of it too is the threat aspect, right? Like identity for them is like, and this happens for a lot of people in America, because I think America, I picked up on this when I was a teenager, kind of forming my own identities. Like America's a religion, it is for a lot of people, right? Like I think we live in a lot of the West lives in a post-religion kind of period, very much agnostic or atheistic kind of secular realm. And I think for people, they supplanted religion, what used to be religion that held that kind of big space in their life and in their spirituality and it was replaced with an Americanism, an American spirituality, where it's like the flag and freedom and liberty, and this idea of what America means is so oversized or outsized compared to maybe what it was to even the founding fathers. Where they might have seen it in a much more, it's a government, we're forming a country, a more pragmatic way. Now to people nowadays, it's the movies, it's Hollywood, it's propaganda, it's a lot of these things that make it way bigger than maybe even what it was for the founding fathers. And my point is just that if people are you're attacking their religion if you throw a little pebble in their direction that could say that something about the way that vision of America is operating isn't quite living up to the standards that we would all want it to. And people just feel attacked. It's so personal for them. Because America isn't just a country for them, it's their religion in a sense.
Which can translate to their safety.
Right. A lot, right? Because religion is so deep and so multifaceted in terms of what it touches in us. So kind of bringing us to the final phase here, I have just a few other questions I would absolutely not be able to end the interview without asking you.
Sure.
What language, you talked about language earlier, what language do you think we should be using when engaging with those around us to maximize the chance of getting through to them or helping get a better outcome? So if someone's clearly, you can hurt people. People say that, if you see someone, they're clearly suffering from something traumatic, there's a trigger. You said earlier, give me 20 minutes was an example you gave, where I just need time to get back to my head.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other tools that you could give people who maybe are not in therapy or don't have the real deep knowledge, but just a cursory, do these couple things and you'll probably have better outcomes? Is there anything else you would advise aside from like maybe a timeout or some of the techniques you already mentioned?
In relationships to connecting with other people?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't mean to sound pessimistic, but a timeout is almost necessary, right? Until we learn how to respond quicker and pick up on, wait, this is something old, right? That takes a little bit of time. So a little bit of self-exploration. If you don't want to go to therapy, there's some amazing resources. There's a lot of workbooks. Read some good materials, like some of the things that we even talked about today, I think are a good starting point, especially that last book that we talked about. It actually has some like writing exercises to help you start looking into like your own like self-talk and how deep that is for us, right? And so I think that like deep breathing can help us get online faster.
Deep breathing?
Yeah.
Okay.
So really it's kind of consists of like 4 seconds of breathing in, holding your breath for 4 seconds, and then when you're blowing out the breath longer, so it's more like 8 seconds, and you really just want to like force it out, right? And that actually does calm like the vagal nerve, which is the nerve responsible for our fight or flight response.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. There's other things people do, like a lot of mindfulness. I know people, they have mixed feelings around yoga and things like that, but there is a lot to benefit from really kind of zoning in on that mind-body connection that we can do through things like yoga. And you don't even have to go anywhere. There's amazing YouTube tutorials, different things like that. One of the things that I say, if you're completely against all of that, and it's really interesting, right? Because prayer for us when we're doing 5 times a day has this component in it, but just simple mindfulness, right? Because if you think about depression is from the past, anxiety is in the future. If you're in the present, you can find peace, right? But we don't often live in the present. So mindfulness means paying attention to the present on purpose. So whatever that means, like sometimes I will just like sit outside and choose one sense to focus on, right? So it'll be closing my eyes and just paying attention to what I'm hearing around. I mean, it's almost like you can hear miles away when you're actually paying attention. And what that's doing is rewiring our brain to be more present, right? Like research has it that about 30 days of like consistent mindfulness practice can have similar calming effects as an antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
So, and this kind of leads me to the other question is, how much does physical exercise, quality of nutrition, quality of, physical, like when you think of taking care of your body, right, impact depression and anxiety?
Oh, okay. So now you're touching on a sensitive topic because my daughter has recently labeled me as a crunchy mom. Do you know what that is?
No.
Okay, good. It's better that you don't. It basically means like those moms who are all like, oh, you have to eat organic, or you have to eat this, or you have to eat that, right? I will say it does impact your health, right? Let's just talk about food for a minute, and then I'll talk about exercise.
Yeah.
It does impact your health. So if you eat something bad for you, it's going to make bad feelings in your body. And bad feelings in your body, if you remember what I said, what a trigger is, right? We create hot spots in our body, okay? I'll give you just an example. Say you were a young kid, somebody punched you in the gut and it was really hard, right? The punch in the gut might not have even been the hard part of this. You may have gone to mom or dad and been like, Mommy, Daddy, somebody punched me in the gut and it really hurts. And if they're not, oh my God, come here, are you okay? Let's go find this kid and, deal with this. And instead you get told, well, what did you do to get punched in the gut, right? Now you created what we call an emotional hotspot, okay? Meaning there's really hard memory stored in that spot of your body. So now let's say you go and you eat an enchilada, okay? And now you have a lot of stomach pain. What do you think might start coming up for you?
Those feelings.
Yeah.
So the physical brought about the actual emotional.
Yes.
Not the opposite.
Yes.
We're always concerned about the opposite. Like, like I asked earlier, the emotional, could that bring about physical manifestation of symptoms? this is the physical symptom
Yes.
triggering the emotional.
Yes. And there's a lot of people that have issues with this take, right? But it really just is matter of fact. Like, look it up. It's all over,
The research is clear.
Yeah. But yes, definitely the emotional distress that we face has physical manifestations, right?
And I've noticed too, in our community, there seems to be a lot of depression and anxiety, and especially I've noticed in stay-at-home moms. This is what we've kind of learned from just interactions with different people. So I guess I always go because maybe I was just an athletic person in my life. In high school, college, I've always maintained like an exercise regime and stuff like that. How much could be improved through exercise, nutrition, like someone just getting out and walking? I tell people, like, some of my advice I try to tell through different channels to people that I hear are struggling with this, because I genuinely care. I want people to be able to find a better quality of life. Is like, do you wake up in the morning and go out, and you don't have to run, just go for a walk. In the evening, go for a walk. Start with that, like, because most people can't just go start running if they've never ran before. Fix your diet, avoid carbs, do this, do that, and slowly just start improving your physical well-being. Yeah. I mean, would you give that same advice, or and of course, I think therapy now is clear, like there's a benefit for a lot of people, but could that be a starting point, I guess, is my question.
So one of the things that I'll say is we have to tread kind of lightly when we give that kind of advice, right? And so we have to know our limitations, what our expertise are, right? So I completely live by that, trying to eat as clean as possible, right? But recommending it to somebody is outside of our scope. But I do talk about food and mood, right? That part we can talk about, that food does impact your mood, right? So as far as exercise goes, though, that is right up our alley, because we know that when you work out, you have an endorphin release, right? And what does endorphin do to depression and anxiety?
It crushes it. I mean, I found it for me.
Yeah.
It definitely works.
Definitely.
I mean, that's anecdotal. It's not statistical studies or anything, but
yeah,
I definitely feel like it helps a lot.
Yes, absolutely. And so I definitely do push exercising. And like you said, I tell people you don't have to go get a gym membership. You don't have to go crazy with your running.
Yeah.
Just move. After 20 minutes, you're going to notice, you're going to feel a lot better, right? You're going to have a pep in your step that you didn't have. Yeah. And exercise actually also has similar value as, like the research tells us, as mindfulness practices when it comes to, managing anxiety and depression. So I definitely ask people to move. There's a lot of resistance around it, though, right? A lot of resistance around, like, you're minimizing my condition to, trauma or to me not moving or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the best way I would explain it to people who aren't sold on it, and just, I'm not a therapist, obviously, but hopefully I get your seal of approval on this. I tell people, like if I was in a situation where I was a housewife and I'm struggling with, let's say, marriage problems as well as depression and anxiety, and it's all kind of like bundled into this ugly ball of quality of life, I would say the going out and walking in the morning and in the evening, and then exercising, and then changing your diet, and not for the other person, because, my husband wants me to lose weight in some negative sense. Like, I want to get better and healthier. One, I think the biggest thing, and I'm not a psychologist, is the reclaiming of something that's your own now.
Yeah.
A lot of housewives, I feel like, lose that if they're having a really problematic relationship. It's like the husband either is not present, they're ignoring them, they're treating them, maybe verbally, there's abuse, whatever. All of those things, or some of those things. And the person just needs to feel like a sense of empowerment again, to be like, I am reclaiming my body, my time. I don't need the kids with me. I want to go walk for 35, 40 minutes. That's my time. And I'm out of here. And I'm going to do this. That's one real benefit I see. And the other is like that sense of reclaiming, like you said earlier, you need to have yourself be fixed and in a good standing and a good situation and health for you to be able to contribute and give to the rest of the family.
Absolutely, right? Which, again, it comes down to also the husband recognizing that and being able to, come home from work and say, I know you need an hour to yourself. Or what do you need? Let me not make assumptions. What do you need? Yeah. Right? But also being mindful that sometimes he may have nothing to give. So an interesting, I'll try to be quick with this, is I always tell, clients that I need you to think about something, okay? Marriage is never 50-50, never. And if you go into it with that mentality, you're toast, okay? Because there's some days that I have nothing to give, right? If my husband has 100% to give and he can carry us that day, great, right? What if he has nothing to give, right? Then what do? Then you have to have a plan. You have to have a plan for what are we going to do for on those days that what we have to give doesn't equal 100%.
Netflix. The kids get on this.
That's
right. What happens nowadays. Well, it's like I'm at 20%. My spouse is at 20%. Today, kids, I know we always preach about the screens. Have the Xbox. You get 4 hours. I'm not that.
No, you're not
people
wrong.
Go to that as a crutch, right?
Or I'd like to call it a plan. Sometimes you don't have anything to give. And if we're talking about boundaries, that's honoring yourself and honoring the other person's needs too, right? So I think I will say one more thing about that when we talk about, people being housewives. And earlier I said it's really hard for a man because, it's harder for you guys to make career changes, right? Like logically, it's just harder.
Especially as you get older and further in your career. I mean, just because, you can't drop everything and just completely change your whole lifestyle. It's very, the fortunate few are able to get like a real balance. Yeah. But it's not common.
And then, you think like kids grow up and then I can do it then. No, because then kids go to college and then their expenses get even more than they were when they were little. So it's like there's not really a break. So you gotta figure things out in a different way than a woman would have to, like traditionally speaking. Yeah. But I would say for that a woman, the choice is even a more difficult one. It is, do I devote my time to my children and my family, or do I devote my time to a career that I've been passionately trying to grow, right? And sometimes I say that I feel actually really blessed that when my children were younger, I was in school, and school's a little more flexible, right? Like I'd be able to go to my classes and be home, and even if I wasn't super present, I was writing papers or whatever, but they were there and I was there. So it felt a little less mom guilty than if my career had started. Because I think I have 3 or 4 therapists on maternity leave right now. Okay, yeah. And it's really hard because I'm like watching how slow like their career growth is versus like mine, where I worked like 3 jobs because by the time I had graduated and everything else, my kids were at least in high school-ish, right? So I was able to like really just go hard, and how different my career looks because I started at a different time, And so that choice is a horrible one. You either end up with mom guilt or you end up with a stunted career, right? But one way or another, something is going to suffer, right? So I can understand why that's the case. Yeah. And then, society is never kind to a mother, right? It's like, oh, what do you mean you're not home with your kids? Or, oh, what do you mean you don't have a job? I know somebody who did not need to work, very well off, right? And basically said, well, when people ask me, I have to pretend I have a job because I feel so bad about myself not having one, right?
This is kind of that cultural, we can stay, are you okay on energy and time? Yeah. We can stay on this a little bit. I think there's been that like a cultural, I would call it nothing short of a revolution, honestly, in America in terms of conservatives and liberals, where I think conservatives are trying to reclaim that and say there was this line pushed for decades about like, feminism and women should be in the workforce and career oriented and all the rest. And there's almost like this, like, I would call it almost like anger or frustration about, well, if I was a housewife and I contributed everything to my wife, my husband and kids, and mostly, kids, trying to raise a family, somehow I'm shamed because of that. Yes. Right. And then also maybe we have diverse friend groups. Like if you're with your other friends who are professionals, they shame you if you're not a professional. But then if you're with your housewife friends, which our community has a lot of traditional people like that, where it's like, oh, look at her. She went out and, put all her kids in daycare and they never see their parents, and that whole stigma. So I think that's like not just for Muslims, but even for like non-Muslim communities, Christians I see going through this. And there's like a reclamation of being like, it's okay to be a housewife if that's what you prioritize and what you want to do and the way you want to raise your kids and you give value to that. But it's also not a crime from like the religious community's perspective. I think there needs to be an understanding that it's not a capital murder, offense if someone has a career and wants to, because I mean, for me personally, like I look at it open-mindedly. Like I think there are phases, and in our, like for my personal relationship, it's like we negotiate like, okay, we're at the phase where we're raising kids. We think it's value added to have mom at home. But then at some point you're like, I want you can go back to school if you want. Now you've got hopefully stability, financial stability. You're better off in your 30s, 40s. What do you want to do? Go rediscover yourself. You want to go get a career, go get a job. Now is my time to kind of just support everything. The kids don't need you at home as much.
Yeah.
Find yourself, do something that you're interested in, passionate about, whatever. So I think the open-mindedness is key, but do you see that open-mindedness within our community, or do you feel like it's very much like rigid, like your expectations are this, and if you don't meet them, you're a failure?
I see a lot more rigidity than I do open-mindedness. And again, I'm not saying all, but I am seeing more of the rigidity, right?
And it's just culture? Or do you think it's religion itself or people's interpretation of what religion, Islam allows?
I'm going to be honest with you. That's a hard one for me, right? And probably because I carry my own mom guilt, right? That, and I'll just share a quick personal kind of funny but sad story, right? So I have two of my kids are married, right? I have a 25-year-old, a 24-year-old, and a 21-year-old, right? My 25-year-old and my 21-year-old are married. And my 25-year-old got married at 21. He comes home from college one day and he says, Mom, I found my future wife. And I'm like, you are the ripe age of 19, right? And he's like, I know, but she wears a hijab. She, is an engineer like me. And, she likes Dragon Ball Z, which is the show that he's like, where am I going to find that again?
Right. It's a perfect combination.
I said, okay, all right, cool, right? And so, we got him engaged and then waited till they both graduated and they got married. And alhamdulillah, 4 years later, they're about to have their baby and everything. And so, alhamdulillah, good things, it worked out, right? But ultimately, it was, he was my oldest, so he was the one used to having some level of attention. And in those, right before I left the hospital, so I had started the practice while I was still at the hospital, right? But at this point, I had moved up to a director position. And so it was insanely busy. I mean, I would be going to work at 5 a.m., staying at the hospital till 5 p.m., then going to the practice from 5 to 9, and then I'd be working weekends, right? I'd come home and I'd knock out and go right to bed. And, at this point, the practice was, like, getting established. Like, right by his wedding, I really didn't need to keep my other job for benefits. I could, figure it out through the practice because that's why I was doing both, right?
Sure.
And he calls me at work one day and he says, Mom, look, I know I'm grown, but there's never a time that you really don't need Mom. And you have a decision to make right now. I'm going to be out of your house in a few months. Do you use some of this time to, spend with me before our lives change forever? Or do you continue doing what you're doing and saying that work is more important? And, that shattered me. That same day, I slid my resignation letter under the door
Really?
at the hospital. Yeah.
That's big of him at that age to say that and frame it in that way, right? Like in terms of like, takes maturity, even for a 25-year-old or about what?
Well, he was 21 at the time.
21.
Yeah.
I mean, that's even, but to recognize in that moment that there was an inflection point about to happen in your lives, that takes a lot of maturity, I think, and care that the relationship matters. And
yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to tell you, I still carry a little bit of regret about, those few years that I really just was never around, right? I'm going to, final thought about something, because you said something and it's burning in my brain, that when you were like, well, yeah, like a mom spends all day, taking care of, the kids and the husband, well, maybe more the kids, that is marital death right there, right? Because I remind couples all the time, the marriage made the children. The children didn't make the marriage, right? You have to remember that the marriage has its own importance. I don't know, however people choose to do that, whether it's carving out a little time every day, having check-ins is really helpful. Like, hey, did you need something today that got overlooked? Or, whatever, just a little check-in to say you matter. It's really important, right? And if you don't do that and you go with this idea, well, like, it's okay, I don't need to matter right now because the kids need it more. Yeah, they probably need it more, but it doesn't mean that you don't need anything at all, right?
Sure.
If we let ourselves not matter for too long, the end result is only resentment. So
Yeah.
for whichever parent that is, we have to matter.
Yeah. How much do you feel like, you mentioned like, you know, some sense of like you have these feelings like those few years where you weren't around as much or whatever. But what I want to explore is there are different types of people, let's be honest. There are people who are like academically and career inclined, and there are people that we all know that just don't seem to be that mold, right? Mm-hmm. There are people with different aptitudes, right? Some people are street smart, some people are book smart, all that. How much do you think it is fair, though, just to play devil's advocate for, I'm trying to play devil's advocate for career women right now and be like, almost like put myself in their shoes and make this stance. You were born academically career inclined mentally. You have this aptitude to be able to do analytics. You know, you really like your leadership skills, organization. You know how to fix problems. I mean, that's what careers are. It's about, can you bring a solution, that kind of stuff. If someone doesn't scratch that itch and they kind of say, I'm just going to be a housewife, how much would that create depression, anxiety, and all kinds of like a loop of like bad quality of life for that person, whereas someone else in the same situation would be perfectly happy? So how much is it that you need that outlet for that person? Certain people need that for them to be the best mother they can be. They aren't going to be a great mother as a housewife because they need to scratch the itch of a job or some kind of challenge mentally beyond managing household chores and duties. Like, you get what I'm kind of saying?
Yeah, it's interesting though, because all those qualities that you mentioned, right, are qualities of a good mom too.
True.
Right? I think that that's a really hard one. I think, like I said, it is hard to be a woman with career aspirations, right? A woman who wants children. And I know there's a lot of women considering foregoing the whole idea because, like, I want my career, right? And I'm sure you know this. It's hard to grow a career on a part-time basis, right?
For sure.
So do I think it can contribute to depression? Yes, but I also think that it's more complicated than that. I think it's like also what's under it. So if all of these qualities can be met in motherhood, then what makes it such that you want to go to work? You know, I remember it was so funny. There's like this, I don't know what the kids call it these days, a meme or something, where the person's like, what's your dream job? And the person goes, I don't dream of labor, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, let's get clear about it. Doesn't the idea of also being able to really focus on, you know, being with your children, but also taking care of yourself, you have some time to do the things like maybe going to the gym or, you know, spending time with friends or whatever, that also feels nice. But then why do we feel bad about that? What is it about us? What did we learn? I know a lot of times I hear from clients like, oh, my parents never gave us an option. We always had to succeed, right? We always needed to be something, right?
Yeah.
And so does it come from that? And I know, you know, Allah yarhamha, my mom passed, you know, a few months ago. Thank you. But I know that, like, I would call her sometimes at 9 o'clock at night, leaving the office after a 12, 13-hour day. And she'd be like, what'd you cook? And I'm like, I didn't. And she's like, well, what's your family going to eat? I'm like, I don't know. I mean,
Take
you know,
out.
yeah, like they have DoorDash on my,
Yeah.
you know, they can, you know, and so because that what was really important to her.
Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes it did create a little bit of guilt. I mean, like, maybe I should have thrown something in the crock pot at 5 a.m. I don't know. Right.
Yeah.
So it also comes down to, again, it's a little deeper, like what's motivating this truly. And I think I will, you know, get off my soapbox of how awful it is to be, you know, stuck between these, because it really is. I'm not going to lie. But earlier I had mentioned like coming from your sense of self. Okay. And our sense of self holds a lot of amazing characteristics that we don't often have access to because we often live in protected states that covers our sense of self and pushes us towards selflessness or what, you know, some would perceive as selfishness. Our sense of self holds a lot of curiosity for ourselves and what's going on for us rather than judgment, and curiosity for others when we can access that part. It has compassion, right? There's clarity in our sense of self, right? And a lot of other beautiful characteristics. we want to be able to access that part. We want to be able to put away all of the parts that are protective, meaning, oh, if I'm the perfect housewife, my mother would be proud, right? Or if I'm a career-driven, motivated person, maybe my dad would really love me, right? What feels good to you? Let's get clear. Let's get curious. Let's show compassion to ourselves that both decisions are really hard and this is really difficult. And I think that could help the depression more than the physical, let me do this. Because whatever is under the depression is old. Remember, depression is from the past.
Yeah, so don't think about it in terms of like societal trends and feminist versus anti-feminist. Like think of it more in terms of for that person, for in their heart of hearts, what does it mean in their context?
Yes.
And for their, much more important.
Yeah.
Because all we hear about on the news and TV is always the, the slogans and the feminism, postmodernist, all that, like, just like I call it like, it's like gumbo soup of just, jargon. But for an individual, what does it mean? Is really, when you think about everything we've talked about, the most important question, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The same circumstance could be perfect for one person and hell for another.
Yeah.
Depending on their background and their...
Yes. And again, this is why I said I think we need to have some kind of follow-up around this concept of like inferiority, right? And how big that is inside everybody, right? But if I want to just like think about it specifically in our community, how bad that feels. And, you're inferior if you don't have a career. You're inferior if your kids are acting up and people are saying, oh, look, see, she doesn't even take care of her kids. That's why they're...
The shaming. That shaming culture, like of shaming people.
Yes.
Like, I don't know why that's such a... It is an Arab thing.
Yeah.
Where it's like you shame people into feeling crummy about for whatever reason. Almost like, I don't know. My theory is that part of it comes from like a degree of, I don't know if it's narcissism truly, but it's like egotistical where it's like it just makes you feel better. There's people, how do you have the tallest building? You either build the tallest building or you knock all the other buildings down kind of thing.
Yes. And so, again, narcissism is rooted in neglect and inferiority, right? And we can have narcissistic traits without being narcissists, right? So that idea of bringing other people down is a narcissistic trait, but also rooted in inferiority. This is not me, justifying the awful behaviors that we often associate to narcissistic behaviors, right? Or tendencies or true narcissistic personality disorder, right?
Yeah. This
is just me really, again, explaining what it is.
I think poverty could play a role too, right?
Oh, definitely.
So we have a lot of people that come from very poor circumstances. My father, certainly, he describes it. He was born and raised in a very, very poor area. And not having much, food insecurity, whatever the way that's perceived by those people growing up in that. It's funny because you could have different siblings have a different recollection of how bad it was. But for him, I definitely know that was like, there was struggles, right? And so I think poverty, class differences in the Middle East, people who grew up overseas. America, it's not as classist. Overseas, I think it is. Feelings of inadequacy around class and around poverty and education and literacy and where you came from, where your roots are from versus someone else that's high class. I think a lot of that can play into the shaming and
100%. Now you're less than.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that requires a lot of the work that you have to do on your own of, I'm still coming from an old lens. Does this make sense? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And one last thing I want to hit on, kind of to bring us to the end, is for me, and I want to talk about this in terms of, and it'll tie into some of the podcast, and we'll talk a little bit too about your practice, and I want to connect people with the resources they need at the end so that if people are excited by this podcast and want to seek therapy, that they can. Is I kind of went through a thing where, and we talked about, some pressure of grandiosity and feeling like the world, you got to fix the world and all that stuff at the beginning of the podcast. For me, I feel like it was very much this sense. I went through a little bit of a crisis where it was, have I been doing enough? And I think from when I was a kid, I was always programmed with those same parent instincts my parents probably had that you described earlier of like, you're going to do this. You got to reach the mountain in terms of impact or in terms of what you're going to be able to do. And actually for some parents, it's even like being a doctor is nothing. Like, oh, you're just going to be a doctor? That's pathetic, right?
Be a surgeon.
You're going to be a surgeon? That's pathetic. You're going to be a rocket? You're going to be the first person to reach Mars? That's pathetic. Reach higher. You're like, where is the limit, right? Where are we trying to reach? And so for me, it took a lot of time in terms of maturing and thinking and deep reflection. I had to boil it down to like, what can I do? I can't just think theoretical anymore of like, I want to change the world. I want to fix all the Arab world, Muslim world's problems, American Muslims problems, whatever, because you can't. But for me, it was, what is something tangible that I know God gifted me with certain skills on, that I'm passionate about, that I care about, that I'm effective in, that I can resource-wise are realistic. I'm not a multi-millionaire, that I can start a path towards to make me feel like I've at least started and tried to do something that will be a positive impact on my community and me as a Muslim and me as a person, as a man, where if I get sick someday and I die, I'd feel like, you know what? I didn't leave anything on the table. I tried everything that I thought I needed to fulfill myself. And I went through that recently, and that's the impetus that, it was actually the Gaza story. So you mentioned your October 7th story briefly. For me, I was traveling for work with my boss, and we were actually in Washington, D.C. at the time, of all places. And I wake up in the morning, we're sitting there at the breakfast bar having eggs or whatever and juice. And then I see on the news the October 7th attack over in Gaza, and Hamas had just, launched this attack and everything else. And this was early on when they were coming out with all the lies about 40 beheaded babies and all this crazy stuff that, it was pretty much painting these people to be Arabs in general, I think, and Muslims to just be the heathen, barbaristic, Star Wars, evil empire, like soulless, humanless kind of entities that they portray. And I found myself in that moment, because my boss, I have a pretty good relationship with him, and we talk stuff other than work sometimes. He was like, I could tell he was going like, my God, what's going on over there? And they know I'm Palestinian, because I'm not ashamed of it in any way. I'm proud, quite the opposite. I always make a point to make sure people know, because I think that the identity is always under threat. And I was sitting there and I was finding myself, because of the news coming out in such a barrage of negative stuff, almost like I was poised and ready to start being ashamed of what had happened and wanting to defend it at the same time. Because I know Muslims. I'm like, you can't convince me. Part of my brain was going, you can't convince me that Muslims would do the things that they're claiming were done. The other part of me was saying, sure seems like a lot of news outlets are saying this is exactly what happened. Like my analytical brain was going, okay, I'm always like trying to play devil's advocate as a person. So it's like, I want to be open-minded. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something really terrible that I just right out of left field just hit me in the back of the head. But at the same time, I'm going, but I know my values. I know my people's values. I know Muslim values. I know Arab culture. There are certain lines that will not be crossed, no matter what you tell me. And I'm sitting there trying to compute this. And then I'm dealing with imposter syndrome that I have. And I'm dealing with me being an Arab American and always having that imposter syndrome for whatever reason. And I'm trying to like talk to him about like how he should be. And I'm always the interpreter in my settings, where I try to explain to people in a nice way, what don't you know about Muslims? What are you misunderstanding, to try to educate people my whole life. And so, but I found myself at a loss for words, and I was just like, I don't know what to tell this person, because the minute I open my mouth, it's going to be an incrimination of me either way. Right. So I really, that was the moment. And then in the days that followed, it was obsessing about what actually happened and realizing there were so many lies, the 40 beheaded babies, the mass rape campaign, all this stuff, and the overall efforts of, the anti-Palestine Israel lobby efforts in the United States, the Zionist, activation of all their online trolls and all the craziness that goes on with trying to prop up something that's indefensible that's going on over there. And I started to just go crazy at posting on Facebook, posting. And it was like, the Facebook algorithm started to work against me, because they started censoring Facebook. They started censoring, for people who don't know, they censored everything. The algorithms would regulate and share all the stuff that was trying to portray what actually happened, or try to give light to that something isn't adding up here. And it was promoting everything that was anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and to try to paint these people as perfectly capable of being like worse than the Nazis. And in that moment, and then there were the months after of watching the horror on TV and on social media of what was going on in Gaza. And I think the biggest thing was the crushing thing that killed a lot of people is the silence and the lack of having a voice.
Yeah.
And at some point I said to myself, that's it. That was that moment. After that, maybe several months, it was like I came to this realization, like, what did God put me on this earth to do as a Muslim? And for me, it was to have a microphone that's as big as possible and to be able to speak to people in a way that they would relate to me and understand how our people are in reality, not what Hollywood and the media portrays, to try to get people to make comparisons fairly and in, apples to apples, not apples to oranges, things like that. And so I said, I got to start a podcast. And so that was what brought us here to today. And the whole purpose of this is really to just, I think we have enough of which we need, the mashayikh that have podcasts about all the things from the masjid and all the spiritual stuff. And we have enough, I think, of I think Mehdi Hassan and other people like him are doing a huge service and battle for all causes that are around Muslims and immigrant communities and Arabs and Pakistan, the Desi community. And it's all politics, though. I think we need something where it's like a table where you can talk about all kinds of topics that are important for us as a community to get better and stronger and prepare ourselves for the future, which I think our kids are seeing. And that if we don't step up and make it something that is native and innate to this America, we're going to end up doing them a disservice, and they're going to continue to perpetuate this sense of inadequacy and imposter syndrome, which I don't want them to have. I want myself to be the end of that, where when they're raised, they're like, the best analogy I give people is like Joseph in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. He was born and raised in another land to a certain age. Then he goes to Egypt. In Egypt, he gets integrated. And I think we as an immigrant community always have this struggle between our parents telling us, it's so much better back home. The kids who are raised back home are so much better. They're so much more appreciative. They know this, they know that. And there's never a realization that there's good and bad. And being born and raised in America has its very good too. That's different than there.
Yes.
And trying to, look at the story of Yusuf alayhi salam as someone who was born outside of Egypt, but then became a man in Egypt, grew up, reached the highest pinnacle of Egypt, and brought his family. I always tell people who bring this up, I'm like, what did he do at the end of the story? Did he leave with his family or did he bring them to Egypt? He brought them.
Yeah.
And so that's, to me, the story of America for Muslims in the West is it doesn't matter where you put a Muslim. A Muslim should be a positive contribution to any society that they're a part of and help everyone, regardless of whether they're Muslim or not.
Absolutely. In
reaching better heights and better, all that stuff. So that's the impetus for the podcast is I want us to try to have conversations around that and try to forge a path where we are not in the future viewed as being negative tropes, cliches, stereotypes, and caricatures of people, but actual people.
Yes.
And people know our stories and they know that we're humans. And all the stuff you talked about, Amina, is really reinforcing that if you're listening and you're a non-Muslim, to understand that we are human beings with the same issues, problems, struggles, dreams, aspirations as everyone else.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
we go through the same, but there's stuff that's unique culturally or whatever, but we all want to be positive contributing members of any place we live, any community, any society. And anything less than that is really, you have to know, is just someone with an agenda trying to paint us in a bad light.
Absolutely.
So that was my soapbox moment to talk a little bit about what kind of brought me to here. And I'm really super appreciative of you coming on and having this conversation. I've learned a lot. I probably will message you later and ask for some of had some really good quotes and little metaphors that you gave that I think are golden.
Be happy to provide.
Yeah. And we can put them in the description on the YouTube video. And I will bring us home asking you to give anyone out there who listened to this and is like, I want therapy. Mm-hmm. Where would you point them? You said you're at capacity. So what should people do who are interested in going to a Muslim therapist if that's what their preference is?
So our wait list is always shifting. So people are welcome to reach out to us, and we will do our best to accommodate. So we can be reached easily if that's okay for me to share. You can email us at hello@fyscounseling.com. So it's hello@ F as in Frank, Y, S as in Sam, counseling.com, and that goes directly to our intake people who can gather some info and see if we have the appropriate therapist. Other than that, there's this really easy way to find therapists. You can go to Psychology Today, which is just a website online. You can type in kind of what you're looking for. They even have like language or religion and all kinds of different things, and insurance and all of that you can plug in so that they can give you a list of different therapists that you can reach out to.
What would you say would be, if someone's really desperately needing therapy and they can't get in to see you and they're Muslim, would you still encourage them to seek therapy with a non-Muslim? Like, should they be afraid, like, oh, they're not going to get me, oh, it's not going to be the same unless I have to see a Muslim, versus prioritizing getting therapy?
I am not of the mentality that you must go to a Muslim, okay? There is benefit in, somebody kind of knowing your culture and you don't have to explain
certain things. Yeah, it's just smoother probably just in terms of interpretation.
Yes, but to be honest with you, I think that's how I learned how I was kind of just living by old cultural expectations, right? That I needed to reconsider, do they still fit for me? I feel like maybe it would be harder for somebody who's Muslim or Arab sometimes, right? If they're not aware yet, because remember what I said, you can't take a client further than you've gone, right? Yeah. And so I think that, speaking to a non-Arab, non-Muslim therapist helped me be like, oh yeah, maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense, really, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of benefit to either or, right? And I would also say that if somebody doesn't feel good, like if you're noticing maybe there's a little bit of bias or, I'm not going to lie, something I don't know that people are aware of is the therapy world is very divided right now because of things happening in Palestine.
How so?
Well,
I would have never thought that plays in. So
you would think,
elaborate,
right?
please.
You would think we'd be the safe space because we're supposed to be all inclusive and accepting. So right after everything in October 7th, this really big social media group on Facebook for Chicago, I don't remember what it was called, but like Chicago area mental health, something or the other, right? There was, I believe, 7,000 therapists in there. And we were getting slammed with, oh, we're offering support for those who are really, struggling because of what, the terrorist attacks on Israel. And then somebody posted a simple, well, we also want to consider the Palestinians and what, they've been facing and what they're going to face. That person got kicked out of the group right away. Then I couldn't take it anymore. So I get on and I'm like, offering free services to anybody who is suffering at the hands of apartheid Israel. Needless to say, I got kicked off.
That went over well.
Not at all. I also got booted from the group.
Yeah.
And so me and the other girl who got booted, we connected, and there was apparently a bunch of people that got booted. And they started a whole separate group so that we didn't continue to get booted from these other groups. And then just the other day, there was a blow up for somebody else, and somebody was getting doxxed. Even during that time, I started getting messages from all over the country from these people who are like, how dare you, you terrorist supporter, you all of these other things. And so people are getting doxxed, people are getting, harassed, people are. And so it's really a little disheartening that therapists, right? Because I don't know why my brain told me we would be immune to that, right?
See, that's what my immediate reaction when you said that was, I was going with, why would that even affect that world?
Yeah.
Like you think it'd be an equal opportunity providing world for therapy for humans, right?
Yeah.
But for that to have even penetrated that is just telling of like how serious the situation is and how sad and how complicated but not complicated. Like people always say it's complicated. Well, it's really not, other than people's lack of knowledge around it.
Yes.
Once you know enough about it, I think it's very simple.
Yes. There was a Zionist supporting, or she actually identified as a Zionist, a therapist in one of these groups the other day, and she somebody had asked, and they literally said, please nobody throw any shade at me. This is what this client needs, and it's our job to take care of our clients. She would like a pro-Palestine therapist. And this lady jumps on and she's like, well, I'm a Zionist. I feel like I'm fully qualified, so why are you discriminating against me in this referral? And that ended so badly, right? It's like, how can you not understand how unsafe someone would feel in therapy? And I would feel like a Zionist would feel unsafe in therapy with a Palestinian.
Yeah.
Right? Like common sense says that, but it got that bad. Yeah. So it's, I don't think anybody's immune, unfortunately.
I think kind of maybe to end on a hopeful note, which I think ties into my story and your story, is people who are listening that are not Muslim, not Palestinian, not Arab should understand something, which is that if you believe that Arabs or Palestinians absolutely are anti-Semitic and dislike or hate Jewish people just because they're Jewish, you could not be further from the truth.
Absolutely.
What you've been told is complete lies and complete, falsehood and whatever else you want to call it, propaganda. There are so many people that I know that are Arab Americans that have colleagues, friends, people that they absolutely get along with and consider to be friends that are Jewish. There are more Jewish people show up to the rallies that are pro-Palestine than I could even count. And I always tell people this in the podcast. It's like, you have been sold a bunch of propaganda into thinking that people are just anti-Semitic. There's, do you have, if you got 1 out of 1,000 or 10,000 people, could you find someone who is, yes, you can do the same thing in a rural Christian community in America. You could do it in a urban Christian community, whatever. People are complicated and they're diverse and whatever else. And there's hateful people everywhere. But what I want people to understand is that the vast majority of people are simply against a political status quo that has been held in place for 75 plus years that is untenable, unethical, immoral, based on racism. It's a supremacist ethno-state kind of program that people are just not going to accept and they're sick of.
Absolutely.
Now, all the rest is noise.
Absolutely.
And we need to be aligned on that and understand that if we care about each other as human beings, we should all be on the same page, which is bringing an end to everything, bringing an end to the occupation, not by ethnically cleansing Palestinians, or repeating the horrors of World War II, but by actually resolving the conflict in a way. If we put the muscle and resources and billions of dollars of the United Nations and the United States towards creating a peaceful resolution, it'd be done. It would have been done decades ago.
Absolutely.
But it's because you want to maintain a status quo on something that is indefensible that everything is complicated. The analogy I gave my kids the other day is, like if you tell your kids like, hey, they got into a fight and one of them's lying about their involvement, and then the lies perpetuate more lies and more lies, and it gets slippery and sticky and ugly. It's like Breaking Bad, where they start out with one step and then they get sucked into the world of like being, meth dealing drug lords over, and because that one step just took them down one, and then the domino effect and whatever. That's what trying to maintain the status quo on something that's unjust and indefensible is.
Absolutely.
If it was easy, if you were on the side of justice, everything would have been simple.
Absolutely.
That's what I tell. It's like the simplest way to explain it without getting in the details. It's like, it's not clear because you're trying to maintain something that's not defensible.
Absolutely.
If it wasn't, it'd be done. It'd be easy.
Yeah.
But, so
it's a tough one.
Yeah. So hopefully people can find resources from this discussion that are helpful and of benefit. And I really appreciate your time. I know this is a long podcast, but it felt like it blew by. I really enjoyed the conversation. And reminder to people, please subscribe, please like, please share. And I'll put all the resources that Amina shared during this podcast at the bottom in the description. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
Take care. Ma salama.